What's up, my over 250 subscribers and the 70% who haven't subscribed yet? Welcome to part 9 of What If a Serial Killer Reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman. If you are enjoying the series, please for me like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. With that, guys, enjoy. POV narration. The Raikage's tired eyes scanned through the papers in front of him. War was a brutal affair. Even if the cloud was prepared for it, they were still facing difficulties, especially now that the Uzumaki clan was more involved than ever. Thankfully, their alliance stood strong. The Rock Cloud Waterfall alliance was stronger than ever. The Mist also joined, changing the name a bit, but the first ones to join the alliance were still the closest. After all, they had all been originally part of the Shinobi Alliance and suffered losses side by side, and now sought out reparations and fought against the world together. Such a nice fairy tale, belonging in a storybook really. But in truth, none of the nations within the Rock Cloud Waterfall Alliance had suffered many losses during the Uzumaki invasion, but they were taking advantage of all the nations that did suffer losses in that incident. But it was all for a noble cause at the end of the day, profit. Still, the Raikage couldn't help but rub his eyes and clench his fists in frustration when remembering the events of the Uzumaki clan invasion. What was supposed to be a sound victory turned into an absolute catastrophe, one in which the Raikage had also lost his son. He was devastated as well, even vowing to go out in the world and look for him, refusing to believe that he was actually dead. He was not allowed to do so. They were, after all, in times of war. Jinchuriki weren't allowed to roam freely even under normal circumstances. But the Raikage appreciated his spirit. In truth, the Raikage himself was also like that at first. But father or not, he had to come to terms with the facts at some point his son was dead. There was absolutely no hope of him being alive. Even if he had been held captive all that time, there was no reason to believe that he hadn't been killed already. After all, there was no ransom request, no effort to even contact him and gloat about it. It was then that the Raikage realized that A was most likely dead at the Grey Fox's hands. And that got him thinking, where exactly did I see a transformation like that of the Grey Fox? His mind immediately thought of the Red Dot, the one person he knew to have such ability. But the transformations were different, vastly different. The Red Dot appeared to not be at all specialized in underwater combat, while the Grey Fox was only specialized in that maybe. They just happened to be of the same clan. It's possible that was the thought process of the Raikage at that time. It was what led him to actually reach out to Ken in the end. The blind assassin found it convenient, as he had something to request of the Raikage as well. Intercepting the retreat orders to the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist was no big deal for someone like the Raikage to pull off. He did his part. Now it was Ken's turn to do his to find out what happened to A. That was all the Raikage asked for. It was all he could ask for. He didn't care about the Mist Village or their alliance. All he really cared about was learning what fate befell his son. Even if he died, I wanted to at least have a body to bury something, however small, to at least give him some semblance of closure. And if there was someone capable enough to find that out, then that person was Ken. The Raikage trusted the man's skills. He just hoped that he wouldn't have to wait for too long. There was also the issue of revenge. The Raikage pondered on it, but he couldn't ask Ken to go after the Grey Fox either. There were too many variables at play for that. Getting involved in the war also didn't feel like something the assassin would be willing to do at the time. There was also the fact that the Grey Fox was part of the Uzumaki clan, which could complicate such requests. After all, the Dark Brotherhood was said to be doing business with the Uzumaki. Most problematically, the Uzumaki were now doing business with several hidden villages. In fact, obviously, they weren't doing any business with the nations that had participated in the failed invasion. The Raikage found the situation as troublesome as could be. The Uzumaki were inadvertently building friendly relations with several nations, so it was going to become harder and harder for him to organize another alliance against the Fuinjutsu Masters. I hope I don't have to wait long for Ken's report. He said that he would get to it right away, but I still expect it to take a few more weeks. The Raikage could only cross his hands and sigh in frustration once more. Patience had never been his strong point. Like father, like son, some things simply never changed. But years of leadership forged the Raikage into a cold, calculating man. He always had just enough patience before jumping headfirst into something, but matters concerning one's family always made patience a difficult virtue to hold onto. It had already been a week since the 7 swordsmen were reported dead. The Raikage didn't care much for them. He was just going to call their death an operational mishap. No one would blame him for it. It was quite the fault, sure, but the Raikage could always blame it on someone else and designate a fall guy. Worsening relations with the Mist was nothing compared to finding out more about his son's fate. Those brooding thoughts ate away at the Raikage's mind for quite a while. There was not a moment of silence where he didn't think about those things, and unless he found closure, He knew that things wouldn't change at all. I need some air, Lord Raikage. A masked man entered the room at that very moment, interrupting the Raikage's inner monologue. What the Raikage grunted as he rubbed his eyebrows in frustration. He was getting irritated easily lately, always being on edge did that to a man. We intercepted a message from the Dark Brotherhood as requested. We brought it to you right away. The Ambu spoke out in a straight tone, not showing any anxiety or fear in front of his leader. There was only reverence in his tone and demeanor. He, like everyone else in the village, madly respected the Raikage. Good, put it on my desk. After that, you can leave. I wish for a moment of privacy. The Raikage's monotone voice was the same, but his eyes lit up in excitement. The Ambu nodded and gently placed the bound scroll on the Raikage's desk, before turning into a blur and disappearing from the room. The Raikage's eyes narrowed as he looked at the scroll on his table. He knew that Ken wouldn't waste his time, nor get his hopes up by sending a random message at such times. So there was really only one possibility: he sure works fast. It had only been 1 week, yet the red dot had already gained enough intel to form a report. The Raikage's lips quivered slightly, turning upwards into a smile as he opened up the scroll. Inside, a report of events was there, from the perspective of the Grey Fox. The Raikage's eyes lit up once more as he read the opening paragraphs. As quite some time has passed since A's disappearance, finding evidence out at sea proved to be a foolish endeavor. Therefore, I used my connection to the Uzumaki in order to get in touch with the Grey Fox. The Raikage couldn't help but appreciate the lengths to which Ken was willing to go in order to get the information. Getting in touch was not something that the Raikage, or any of his allies, had been able to do. But the report of the Grey Fox, it was not a pleasant one. At first, I was fighting the Raikage's son underwater. We were both trying to get the better of each other. I was mostly trying to run away. It was guerrilla warfare at the end of the day. We didn't wish to openly engage people like the Raikage or his son, but as I was retreating, he was following me, and before I even realized it, his entire body was engulfed in a white light. It disappeared completely. The only thing left off of him was his arm, which was outstretched, grabbing onto my tail. That was the account of the Grey Fox. For a second, the Raikage felt his breath quickening, his mind filling with rage. He could recognize the jutsu even from such basic descriptions. The dust release of the Tsuchikage, wait, the Grey Fox could technically be lying. I can't take his words at face value, but Ken's next words seemed to give them more clarity. I believe this is the true version of events. I made it clear that I was searching for A of my own volition. We were friends at the end of the day. While there is a possibility the Grey Fox could have lied, I am inclined to believe him. More members of his squad were able to provide similar renditions of this same story. The Raikage's fist trembled as his desk filled with cracks, every muscle in his body twisted in rage as he clenched his fists harder. After all that time, he finally had a target for that rage. The most possible outcome. After all, there was no way anything else could have taken A out so quickly, without leaving any trace at all. The story was not only believable, but it was also so obvious that the Raikage was mad he didn't figure it out beforehand. But the Tsuchikage wasn't the only target for his rage. One of the members in the Grey Fox's squad witnessed the cage of the waterfall pocket the arm. It should still be in his possession. The Tsuchikage should also be aware of your son's demise, as the Jinchuriki went to visit him right after the ordeal. The Raikage ground his teeth together in rage. They lied to me, the both of them. So many tears, so many hours wasted, so much frustration, so much rage, all because of them. I'll show them, I'll show them. EOV Kentucky. Are you sure this will work, sir? Tosho stood by my side, and both of us sat in a tent in the field. I summoned him here not long after I sent that message to the Raikage. I explained the situation to him, brought him here for counsel, and in case I need someone to read things for me. I didn't quite explain the whole scheme to the Hokage. He demanded payment up front for the mission, as he isn't quite sure I can pull such a thing off. Of course, it will work. I may not be the best judge of character, but Raikage and his son were open books. I can already guess how he will react. It's only a matter of time before their flimsy alliance breaks apart. Tosho nodded at my words. He seems to also wholeheartedly trust my judgment. So what is the next course of action for us? A good question. Before deciding on my next move, what would be the next move for our opponents? Let's go with the most obvious. Knowing the Raikage and the rage he must be feeling, he'll seek revenge as soon as possible. The Raikage will likely call a meeting first to catch the both of them unaware, and try and kill them in one fell swoop. I can feel Tosho rubbing his chin by my side. Do we intervene at that point? Or rather, do we intervene at all? For now, we set up camp and wait. I'll try to spy on them, and make sure everything goes according to plan. Their meetings always happen on neutral grounds, so I should be able to sneak in and out rather easily. My voice and the wind are the only two things that can be heard in this lonely tent. Tosho is so quiet that even his breathing is muffled, but he seems to have understood the plan. Very well, in that case, we wait. POV narration. The Raikage huffed as he observed his shinobi as they set up the tents for the impromptu military camp that their meeting was going to take place in. This isn't going to be a pretty affair. But I need to get to the bottom of this. The Reikage had calmed down slightly, all that anger turned into calm. His eyes gained a coldness that they hadn't had in years. Ever since his own brother had died, the previous bee. Also the previous Jinchuriki of the Eighth Tails. The man had died because the Eighth Tails had managed to break the seal placed on him. At that time, the Reikage had almost murdered the tail beast in a fit of rage, leaving it unconscious in the middle of a lake surrounded by collapsed hills and mountains. That battle had lasted 3 days and nights against a being that knew no fatigue. But he won regardless. He won only because his rage settled in the middle of the fight, his mind clearing in time for him to salvage things and fight with calculated efficiency, befitting his status. It was also that moment he had gained a scar on his chest too. Falling on his own hell spear as he passed out from fatigue, nothing of that sort would have happened had he fought conservatively the entire time. Therefore, the Reikage now had a perfect reminder of what letting your anger control you could lead to. Even if the matter now concerned his son, his own blood, he still couldn't allow his anger to control him. That was why he wasn't going in alone this time around. Reikage Yo was by his side. I am glad you decided to join. The Reikage nodded to the Jinchuriki. The death of A had affected him heavily, to the point where he was a lot less upbeat. His passion for music was still the same, but he seemed to be pulling out his notebook and writing down lyrics less and less. The Jinchuriki was simply not in the right space to write his lyrics. Not while his brother, A, was dead and his killers roamed free. The Reikage didn't force him to join the operation. He wanted the village to at least have a last defense, in case he found his end on the very field they stood in. But B wanted to come regardless. He wanted to be there to help put his brother's killers to rest. Even so, the two of them understood that their opponents were powerful. They would have to get very creative if they wanted to be able to kill them. Simply blitzing them wasn't going to cut it, so they needed to prepare the field and hope that they didn't bring all that many guards with them. On their side, they had brought quite a few people, but also left a lot of them in the village, making sure that it was going to be protected regardless of their absence. They were forced to pull back from all foreign nations that they were invading. It was certainly going to rouse a bit of suspicion, but the Reikage couldn't afford to spread his forces out too thin. The fact that E and B were both there was bad enough on its own. They needed to make sure that the Cloud Village was defended well. Failure was simply not an option for them. How much do you think it's going to take them to arrive? The Jinchuriki lost his musical intonation as he looked at the already set up tents in the military camp. The Reikage looked at the sky and raised his hand, making it into a clenched fist. He could feel a bit of wind on his face as some dust rose up around them. The Jinchuriki simply looked at the Reikage's fist, where a rather large bird had landed. The Reikage held onto its claw and took the message that was tied to its leg, before simply letting go of it and allowing it to fly away. Almost mechanically, he looked at the message and studied it with those same cold eyes, narrowing them slightly when he got halfway through it. Probably another day or two more than that, and they'd be showing disrespect. A complication has occurred. However, B raised an eyebrow at the Reikage's words, his mouth twisted into a scowl. Complication. The Mist is also joining this meeting, rather displeased that they weren't invited to begin with. The Reikage seemed to mimic B's scowl. Shit, B cussed out loud as he looked around their camp once more. Can we deal with 3 Cage and their guards just by ourselves? The short answer was maybe. Even with the element of surprise, they had no way of killing all 3 of them. There was also the possibility of the Mist retreating when finding out that they had no finger in the pie. That was the unfolding situation. But that was also unlikely. What do we do, Lord Reikage? E bit into his fingernail for a few seconds, trying to think of ways the situation could improve. The fear that his brother wouldn't see justice in that meeting was the worst part. Tell the others to send a message to the Mist. Tell them to back off, but don't give them any details. If they continue regardless, then they had their minds set from the start. The Reikage's scowl deepened as he thought of the situation more and more. Immediately, the possibility that the Mist was seeking revenge for the death of its swordsman became a huge possibility. In light of more recent events, he hadn't bothered to hide the Cloud's involvement in that whole matter all that well. At least not well enough for the Mist, apparently in this case. It might be better to just kill the Mizukage. As well, the Reikage stroked his white beard as the paper in his other hand burned, scorched by lightning in a split second. I will relay your orders further. B bowed slightly and ran off to do as he said. The Reikage knew that the Jinchuriki was still worried, but his mind was becoming calmer and calmer by the minute. The 3rd Mizukage is coming in person, alongside whatever other guards he can bring. While he was not as strong as the 2nd Mizukage, the 3rd was still very powerful. A user of lava release and also soot release, he was an extremely troublesome opponent, and could put cogs in the wheels of their plans. The Reikage knew he was stronger than the Mist Cage, but he knew that defeating him alongside the Tsuchikage in the Cage of the Waterfall was going to be almost impossible. The Tsuchikage alone was going to need the Reikage's full attention. His dust release was the most dangerous out of all the people that were going to be present there. We might need outside help. The Reikage didn't like the idea of asking for help regarding his son's murder. It felt like he simply wasn't strong enough to take it on his own. But if he missed the chance he had created right now, he would lose the element of surprise. That Tsuchikage wasn't stupid. He and the Jinchuriki of the waterfall both knew their guilt, and it was highly likely that they suspected something bad was happening. The Reikage himself knew that he wouldn't be able to find it in himself to act all friendly with the killer of his son, so he knew that the friendly facade would fall flat rather quickly. Things are bound to get colder within our alliance. If I don't act tonight, another opportunity like this will not show up again. We need to grasp it. So, he now had to choose. Try their luck as they are right now, with a high possibility of losing the fight and being forced to retreat, or call for help from any allies. But who could he even call? Immediately, his mind went to the nearby lands, those that could hopefully make it in time for the meeting. For a second, he considered reaching out to the Leaf, but decided against it. They couldn't be trusted not to take advantage of the situation if the Reikage or B were left weakened after their fights. There were also some smaller lands nearby, but they were all enemies of the Cloud, so they also couldn't be relied upon. So that left him with only one reliable party to call for aid, one that could still be nearby, the Dark Brotherhood. They had delivered a message to him rather quickly. It was fair to say they would be able to make it in time as well. He knew the red dot was extremely fast, so if anyone in the world would make it in time, then it was him. I need to contact him. Now contact the agents in the Land of Iron. Send a message to the Dark Brotherhood. Urgently. The Reikage's shout reverberated throughout the camp. A masked figure nodded and turned into a blur, vanishing into the distance to contact the others and relay the orders. Meanwhile, the Reikage went and personally started writing up the message, while his men prepared the means of transportation. Let's hope for the best. Around a day later, Ken sat on his chair, listening to the wind outside his tent while his legs were crossed and rested on the table in front of him. Breaking up the alliance of the Cloud, Rock, Waterfall and Mist was a rather simple task in his lack of eyes. It was something he wanted to do regardless of his deal with the Hokage. The reason was rather simple as well. He had the means to do it, and it was something he felt was the right thing to do. He hoped that it would put a stop to the Third Shinobi War, or at least reduce its scale in a meaningful enough way. The fact that he could also use this to not have to pay the Leaf anything for their help in reaching Mount Mamboka. So, you're telling me the Reikage wants to pay me in order to help avenge his son, who I killed? The unmasked assassin scratched his chin as he listened to Tosho read out the message. Well, essentially, at least this is what one of Subiro's clones intercepted from a carrier hawk. He sent it to us immediately. The turtles are still a reliable mode of transporting information, thankfully. Tosho responded with a slight nod. The Samahada on his back seemed to wriggle in amusement for a few seconds before settling down, when the first blade slapped its hilt. Well, I can't refuse an offer that good. Being there in person might also help against their attempts to reject the Reikage's accusations. The blind monster slowly stood up, putting his mask on, covering the large smile that was currently spreading on his lips. I suggest you wait another day to make your way there. Wouldn't want to arouse suspicion by getting there too soon. Ken hummed a bit when hearing Tosho's suggestion, considering it for a moment before shrugging his shoulders and laughing a bit. Oh, I say we just head there now. Just claim we were hunting down some random rogue in a nearby land. You're coming with, by the way. Ken patted the first blade on the shoulder and started slowly walking out of the tent. Tosho blinked a few times and turned around to watch Ken's back as he left the tent. The living blade on his back wriggled a bit. Tosho assumed it did its equivalent of a shrug. I will never be able to fully guess what is on Lord Ken's mind. POV narration. The Tsuchikage felt unease as he looked at the military tents that were set up in the distance. He had only brought a few people with him, those that he could spare, around 10 Anbu members. Inoki had thought of also bringing Katsuchi, his son, along, but decided against it since the meeting in itself seemed to be quite spontaneous. Most of their shinobi was still actively engaged in conflict, and the sudden military meeting that the Reikage requested left them somewhat open. The Cage of the Waterfall, Yusuzo, was also in a very similar position. With him, he only brought around 5 Anbu members, and 2 shinobi squads of Jonin leading Chunin, a total of only 11 people. It wasn't much, but the Jinchuriki doubted that the Reikage was going to launch an all-out assault against their enemy, with only the forces they brought to the meeting. But Yusuzo, much like Inoki, felt extremely uneasy. Granted, the Jinchuriki always felt uneasy near the Reikage ever since that incident. This, however, was different. The two of them looked at each other, their gazes meeting and eyes narrowing. It was not something they could explain, just a strange unease, the type a wild animal would get before a disaster occurred in their forest. Immediately, their minds jumped to the worst conclusion. Did he find out? But it was impossible. In the Tsuchikage's mind, the only evidence that existed was destroyed that day. And the Reikage was not so brash as to act without proper evidence, right? Yes, he was likely just overthinking things. The Reikage was his ally for now. He was going to stay cautious, as always, but he didn't need to worry too much over things that were unlikely. Unlike him, Yusuzo was not able to calm down effectively internally. He was panicking a lot, his mind running on overdrive, trying to think of ways that the Reikage could find out. The only feasible one to him was if he contacted the Grey Fox, or the Grey Fox contacted him. but the Reikage wouldn't be so stupid as to believe an enemy and turn against his allies. The Grey Fox, even if he witnessed those events with his own eyes, had no way of proving anything. The burden of proof was his to bear, and since he was an enemy, it was unlikely that the Reikage would take his words over theirs. Unfortunately for the Jinchuriki, no matter how careful and intelligent one person was, they always missed something. In this instance, Yasuzo didn't consider the possibility of a trusted third party collecting the information from the Grey Fox and vouching for its credibility regardless. The Jinchuriki opted to tread carefully while in the camp, and right behind them arrived the Mr. Party of around 20 shinobi, Anbu and Jonin, all trailing behind one man. He was handsome and tall, with black sclerae and no visible pupils. He also had long black hair that reached down to his back, and on his head he also wore a blue cage hat. He wore the standard Kurigaka attire complete with pinstriped arm and leg guards, over which he wore an open white coat that covered most of his back. That man was the Mizukage, and he was also planning something, but it wasn't going to go in line with Yasuzo's thread carefully dogma. No, he had invited himself to that meeting in order to ask for an explanation, a good reason why the Cloud had interfered with their operations and had gotten the 7 swordsmen killed. The evidence he had was scarce, but all signs were pointing towards the Cloud, and he had no other lead to go after, hence his appearance there. He planned to inquire about the situation as well as ask for a proper report regarding the situation from the Reikage, who was supposed to be watching over the front with the Leaf Village. All of the cage greeted each other outside the camp before proceeding. It didn't take more than a few seconds for them to realize that the Reikage had pulled in a lot of people in that camp. There were easily around 30 Anbu in there, which was a bit excessive. The Mizukage raised an eyebrow when seeing just how many of them there were, somewhat confused since the Cloud was supposedly fighting on quite a few different fronts. I guess it's a show of strength, that was his best guess. It wasn't like the presence of a few Anbu made that big a difference. At the end of the day, the Reikage alone was enough of a threat to keep them all on their toes. Yasuzo and Inoki thought the same, but something else was welling up inside them as well. Suspicion and paranoia were mounting, but it was already too late to back off. The worst had yet to come, unfortunately, as they all left their troops in the middle of the camp and walked inside the biggest tent. Inside greeted them a few chairs, 5 of them to be exact, and some people were already waiting inside. On one seat sat the Reikage, his arms crossed and expression bordering on impatience. Behind him stood Killer Bee, the Jinchuriki of the 8 Tails, yet another massive red flag for the Rock Waterfall Cage duo. But an even bigger red flag was sat down right across the Reikage, a tall man with long spiky hair reaching all the way down his back. His body was mostly covered in an open black coat, only revealing a few bits of red samurai armor. He also wore a pair of steel-toe boots, and the most recognizable part, a white mask with a large red dot in the center of it. The red dot. Yasuzo and Inoki both stared at the man with narrowed eyes. At that moment, the Jinchuriki also remembered his suspicions of the red dot being related to the Grey Fox. The pieces started slowly setting themselves into place, but he didn't have all the time in the world to consider things. "Sit down, all of you." The Reikage's voice urged them to take a seat. The cage didn't immediately listen. Instead, they started questioning the assassin elephant in the room. Why is he here? The Mizukage was the first one to do so. He was already well aware that the Duck Brotherhood were the ones to kill the 7 swordsmen of the Mist. His presence there may as well have been the Reikage declaring war on the Mist. It was offensive to that level. The most annoying part was that the Mizukage had zero hopes of being able to kill Ken at that moment, even if he tried. Killing someone at their level required a lot of planning and preparation. One couldn't just jump headfirst into such things. Ken here is an ally of mine. I invited him because I wish for him to join us. The Reikage was the one to answer, keeping his tone cold while speaking. The other cage all seemed shocked when hearing that, the Mizukage especially. But before he could open his mouth and disagree with such a decision, the masked assassin moved, turning his head towards the Mist Cage, and finally speaking out in a gruff voice. "Lord Mizukage, I presume the situation with the 7 swordsmen of the Mist was nothing more than a personal matter. They killed people I hold dear. I have nothing against the Mist itself." His explanation was short, his tone almost emotionless. The Mizukage raised an eyebrow, taking a good look at the assassin. "A personal vendetta, huh? I guess acting recklessly eventually caught up with them. Still, he still dealt a blow to the Mist by killing them. Fine, but I wish to speak more with you later, alone. I also wish for the blades to be returned to the Mist. They are the treasures of our village, after all." The Mizukage could only sigh and accept defeat. It wasn't like their village had the resources to even go after the likes of Ken. They were in the middle of a bloody war. They couldn't afford to spare any resources at all. "Of course, we can speak about that later on." Ken simply nodded, agreeing on a one-to-one conversation seemingly on a whim. The Reikage looked at the assassin for a second, before the corner of his lips turned upwards. and he shook his head. Later all of you will be dead regardless. The Reikage smiled internally as that thought wriggled in his mind for a few seconds. The Mizukage eventually nodded and sat down, taking the seat furthest away from Ken. The Tsuchikage soon followed, taking the seat behind him, while eyeing the taller assassin with a quizzical gaze. Wasn't he reportedly smaller? A fake? Doubtful. He feels too dangerous to be one. Maybe some sort of appearance-altering jutsu that's not detectable even by us. The Tsuchikage couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he didn't like looking at the strange assassin. His presence was fleeting, a ghost in human clothing, exactly as the rumors described him in all aspects. But his size. Now, the only one left standing was Yusuzo, who seemed transfixed on Ken for a few seconds. His tailed beast screamed warnings in his mind. Don't get close to that thing. Get us out of here. The seven-tailed beast seemed completely against the meeting now. It seemed to be completely unnerved by the assassin's presence. Shimei wriggled inside Yusuzo's mind, trying to comprehend what it was looking at. But it felt like she was looking at an unsolvable Rubik's Cube. A human that was more nature energy than man, being almost entirely made out of the energy that was supposed to be extremely fickle and dangerous to control for humans. Anything wrong, Lord Yusuzo? Before the Jinchuriki even realized the red dot's mask was already facing him, almost as if he was making eye contact. Almost as if on instinct, the Jinchuriki looked away, his back filling with sweat. He concealed his anxiety as he shook his head and stepped forward, sitting down on the chair closest to the abomination. He felt uncomfortable even sitting near him. It was almost as if he could constantly feel something crawling around his neck. The others looked at the scene and felt a bit odd. Why is he putting so much pressure on Yusuzo? The Tsuchikage raised an eyebrow, unsure what to think of the situation. He assumed it was because of the fact that Yusuzo was a Jinchuriki, maybe some sort of prejudice of sorts. The Mizukage had similar thoughts, while the Reikage was a bit confused. Meanwhile, Ken just stared at the man and the Jinchuriki in him with a small smile on his covered face. He seemed pretty smart, better not give him the opportunity to think too much. The pressure he was putting on Yusuzo was nothing more than a form of killing intent projected outwardly using nature energy. It gave the atmosphere around him a gloomy vibe, and made for a very good scare tactic. Ken was not expecting it to work so effectively on a cage, however. He had no way of knowing that he was being inadvertently helped by the tailed beast within Yusuzo, who was unnerved and scared of him, before he had even started projecting that aura. Now that everyone is seated, I think it's time we start this meeting. I'm sure everyone is curious why I called it in the first place. The Reikage decided to start speaking, not dwelling too much on why Ken was intimidating the spineless Jinchuriki. The other cage immediately started paying attention to him, Yusuzo included. He was still uncomfortable, but seemed to have somewhat accustomed to Ken's intimidation tactic after a bit. I assume it's to announce bringing Ken in. I am a bit offended that you didn't call me as well. However, the Mizukage spoke out, his eyes turning towards the Reikage. The cloud leader just shrugged. Honestly, didn't know how you'd take the news. I wanted to talk with the others first, then address you formally as well. The Mizukage nodded, seemingly accepting that explanation for now, but in all honesty, it was something else that I wanted to discuss, and it mainly just concerns the other two, not you. The Reikage narrowed his eyes towards the Tsuchikage and the Jinchuriki. At that point, both of them seemed to be taken aback, gulping slightly as the words they hoped to never hear left his mouth. Why did you kill and hide the remains of my son? EOV narration. Why did you kill and hide the remains of my son? The Reikage's words echoed throughout the tent. His accusatory tone and cold gaze sent a shiver through the spines of the people involved. The Mizukage was the most surprised, however. His eyebrows rose in confusion as the entire image finally clicked in for him. Wait, does that mean? The Mizukage turned his head and looked towards the red dot with wide eyes. He's likely here to help the Reikage for some reason. I feel like I shouldn't be getting involved in this, but... The Mist Village leader pondered about taking revenge for the seven swordsmen once more. The preparation he needed was nullified by the fact that he had both the Tsuchikage and a Jinchuriki by his side. Sure, they still needed to deal with B and the Reikage, but the Mizukage had high hopes of being able to hold the assassin back enough for at least the Tsuchikage to be done with his fight. The Reikage was strong, sure, but so was the Tsuchikage. In fact, Inoki was the one with the strongest attack power in the room, one that completely ignored defenses. The Reikage's question managed to do one thing. Besides putting the cage on the spot, it also warned them. They now couldn't be taken by surprise if a fight was to break out. To the Mizukage, that felt like a grave mistake. Yes, I can use this to get rid of the red dot. If he's gone, the Dark Brotherhood will fall with him, and we'll be able to recover our swords as well as save some face. At having lost good jonin to bounty hunters in the end, it all came down to that. The Mizukage suppressed a smile as a perfect picture started developing in his mind. Alas, the third Mizukage still had much to learn. Despite being the right hand of the second Mizukage, he still didn't personally know either Inoki or Yasuzo. There was never going to be a surprise attack, because the two of them would never be taken by surprise so easily, especially not when they knew their guilt and were already cautious around the cloud. The Reikage understood that, so he decided to try and get some answers out of them, to better understand why such fate would befall his son. That is quite the accusation to throw around. Lord Reikage Inoki seemed to recover from the shock first. Yasuzo also recovered eventually. He took another glance towards the bounty hunter/assassin standing by his side. The Jinchuriki's eyes widened as he immediately reached the same conclusion that the Mizukage did. Shit. The red dot is here as hired help, but the Tsuchikage has the right idea. Maybe we can talk our way out of this. Accusation? Huh, then would you like to explain why exactly my son's arm, the only thing left of him, is in the Jinchuriki's possession? The Reikage's face shifted in rage as veins popped up on his forehead, and lighting flickered around his hair as he spoke. The Tsuchikage scoffed. What arm? Why would Yasuzo have such a thing? That's right. I find such an insinuation to be insulting. Yasuzo gritted his teeth as he composed himself enough to speak out as well. We are willing to forget this happened. The Jinchuriki was interrupted when he tried to continue. Insulting? Is that so? Ken, who sat by his side, seemed to turn his masked face towards him. What do I? Yasuzo was about to verbally lash out to question the assassin's meddling in the matter, but Ken's pressure seemed to build up as he interrupted the Jinchuriki once more. If it's nothing more than a baseless accusation, then I guess you wouldn't mind if we searched you, right? That way, there will be no more suspicion, and we can go on with this meeting. The Reikage nodded at Ken's suggestion, his eyes narrowing. He appreciated the fact that Ken was helping confirm their information. After all, A's arm was an extremely valuable piece of blackmail towards the Tsuchikage. It was something that Yasuzo couldn't afford to entrust to anyone else, nor store anywhere. It was something that was much safer with Yasuzo's eye permanently on it, therefore it was likely on him at all times. That's preposterous. How can I accept such a thing? The blind assassin smiled underneath his mask, realizing that he had hit the nail right on the head, before he continued applying more pressure verbally. Well, as I've said, by allowing a search, you would prove your honesty, and if nothing can be found on you, then you are clearly innocent, and without that arm, the Tsuchikage would also be able to claim innocence unless proven otherwise. Ken's words were like a bucket of cold water pouring onto the Jinchuriki's head. The sleight of hand he pulled on the, at the time, panicked Inoki was now coming back to bite him in the ass, and in colossal fashion. Fine, whatever. Just allow them to search you, Yasuzo. Inoki crossed his arms and huffed when hearing Ken's words. There shouldn't be any issue then. I'm glad I destroyed that arm back then. I guess it was the right choice in the end. Internally, Inoki couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. His relief made him somewhat oblivious to the panic that Yasuzo was displaying, unfortunately. But the Mizukage wasn't at all oblivious. He could feel the slight shift in the tone of the usually stoic Jinchuriki. He could see the man's eyes jumping around the room. This situation is looking more and more interesting. The Mizukage rubbed his chin as he noticed the discrepancy between the behavior displayed by the Tsuchikage and the one displayed by Yasuzo. Don't tell me it wasn't hard for him, as an observant third party, to put together the pieces of what had occurred. The Mizukage would have smiled in amusement at the situation was it not inappropriate. Aye. Yasuzo's tone contained to sound more and more frantic, losing his usual cool demeanor in the process. This time, it was impossible for the Tsuchikage to not notice it. The old man's eyes widened as he immediately turned his head towards the Jinchuriki. Don't tell me. Inoki gritted his teeth as he finally put the pieces together. His anger was skyrocketing. Internally, he started weighing his options. This fool pulled a fast one on me, and he clearly has that arm on him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be acting as if there's a stick up his ass. The first thing Inoki thought about doing was outright disintegrating Yasuzo in anger for his betrayal. That would get rid of the evidence, sure, but that would also leave him in a bad/incriminating position. The Reikage was certainly just going to take that as an admission of guilt, and the Tsuchikage was not going to attempt to fight both B and the Reikage at the same time. He then turned his gaze towards the Mizukage, who nodded, providing him exactly the assurance he needed. The Mizukage is helping us. Likely wants to settle his dispute with the red dot. We can work with this. You'd better give me an explanation after this, Inoki whispered to Yasuzo, before he immediately brought his hands together. Dust release. Detachment of the primitive world technique. A white square immediately came out of the Tsuchikage's palms. It violently expanded towards the sitting Reikage and B, who were both in range. In a split second, the Reikage's body was completely covered by black lighting, his eyes filling with rage as he rolled backwards and grabbed B, pulling him aside as the chair and everything around it disintegrated. The Tsuchikage was surprised, but he didn't get the time to speak. Before he could even react, the enraged Reikage was already on him. How dare you? With an enraged shout, the Reikage's hand expanded into a large black lighting claw, which slashed towards the Tsuchikage. Inoki was by no means slow, but even so, he was only able to slightly shift his body and fly upwards, avoiding a lethal attack. But the claws still dug into his body, dealing quite a bit of damage. and leaving 2 slices across his chest and 1 on his face. The Tsuchikage was immediately sent flying, breaking through the roof of the tent as he also flew upwards of his own volition to avoid any further punishment from the Reikage. Inoki looked down, his eyes wide in shock, as he watched the tent he left behind burst into an explosion, both purple and yellow lights flashing out of it. The entire camp was swiped by a powerful gust of wind as the pressure broke all of the tents with ease. Inoki could clearly see Yasuzo and be grappling. These purplish octopus tentacles wrapped around Yasuzo's yellow segmented tail. The 8-tailed Jinchuriki was clearly overpowering the 7-tailed one. The chakra tentacles pulled onto Yasuzo, dragging him towards B, who was already almost fully transformed. His entire body was covered in purplish chakra and bones, his head had grown long and pointed horns. Yasuzo was also transformed, a yellow coat covered his entire body. His wings grew out of his back. He tried to fly away and gain more distance from B, but the cloud wrapper was not giving him an inch. Inoki only scoffed when seeing that, realizing that Yasuzo wouldn't be much help against the Reikage, who looked up at him with anger still. The Tsuchikage noticed that the Reikage was not even attempting to target Yasuzo, which confirmed something else for him. I guess they delegated roles already as expected. The Reikage never had the intention of letting them walk out of that tent unscratched. As the dust cleared slightly, Inoki noticed something else. The red dot was still lounging on his chair, unbothered by the fights going on around him. There was only some blood around his chair, signifying that something had happened there. The Mizukage was nowhere to be seen. Shit, I have to at least get rid of the Reikage. Inoki gritted his teeth and floated down a bit more, putting his hand together once more and concentrating. Dust release. This time, a pillar-shaped ray fell down from the sky towards the Reikage, who moved out of the way immediately. Inoki grunted a bit, realizing that he wouldn't be able to hit the Reikage at all under those circumstances. The camp was already in chaos. The cloud shinobi that were present already attacked, and killed a few of the shinobi from the other villages. Shit, as expected, we walked right into a trap. At that moment, Inoki cursed himself for not following his intuition, and just calling off the meeting or not attending it at all. Too late for regrets. I'll at least kill as many people from the cloud as I can. The Reikage can't walk on air, so I am relatively safe. Here Inoki smiled at that point, and directed his attention at the shinobi below, his eyes glinting slightly. Then, a shiver passed down his spine, as he immediately rolled backwards in midair, and a black flash passed right by him, only scratching his back slightly as it continued to go upwards. Inoki's panicked gaze immediately turned to the skies, only to see the Reikage already above him. The Reikage roared as he kicked the air behind him, immediately propelling himself towards the Tsuchikage, who managed to roll to the side once more, his focus fully on dodging his enemy's attacks. Down below, Yasuzo was not having the best time of his life. When he noticed Inoki's intention to attack, the very first thing he did was raise his hand towards the red dot, much to the disagreement of the tailed beast within him. Yasuzo was hoping to at least take him by surprise and land some hit, but all that it led to was him getting his chest sliced open in the blink of an eye. The Jinchuriki didn't even see Ken draw his blade, but the assassin's hand was already on its hilt, before he even realized it. After that he was bum-rushed by an enraged bee, who almost impaled him on his horns, was it not for his tailed beast reacting in time, and giving him chakra to protect himself with. Ken continued sitting on his chair. The only visible reaction to the whole situation from him was the fact that his hair moved in the wind. The Jinchuriki was stuck in their own stalemate, and he was just a casual observer. Or he would have been, was it not for the presence of the Mizukage. The mist leader acted quickly after all hell broke loose. He didn't allow Ken to sit for too long. Lava release. Scorched earth. The Mizukage's hands were a blur as he finished the hand signs in milliseconds and punched the ground. Immediately, the whole area around him erupted in lava, the ground cracking with dryness and the rocks boiling with anger. The red dot's chair had lava rise up from all sides, covering it in seconds. Let's see him dodge that. But just as the Mizukage was getting excited, the red dot appeared from a puff of volcanic smoke behind him and swung his blade towards his exposed back. The Mizukage reacted in time thankfully, turning around and trying to block the sword with a tanto of his own. Sparks flew as the Mizukage's blade filled with chakra. The man was determined to stop the assassin's blade. He was so fixated on the assassin's blade that he missed the fact that the assassin's arm seemed to suddenly become bulkier, and became covered in thick scales. All it took was for him to blink once, and the next thing the Mizukage knew was that he was flying out of the destroyed camp and into the forest, with a broken hilt in his hand as well as a swollen wrist. Ken, who stood tall in the middle of the camp, flexed his scaled arm and gripped his sword with a calm smile beneath his mask. Things went even better than planned regardless of who wins. I win, might as well have some fun with the Mizukage. And just like that, the blind monster vanished from the chaotic camp. EOV narration. The Mizukage rolled to break the momentum as he passed through a few trees. He felt pain, but his mind was not fixated on it. Instead, his eyes were wide open looking at the direction he came from. Shit. I could barely react to him, and he's much stronger than me. I can't possibly block his blade. Just so you know, attacking me means you aren't getting your swords back. The Mizukige's blood turned cold, his eyes widening as he heard a voice from above him. He immediately rolled to the side and looked up. The masked assassin was just sitting down on a sturdy tree branch, legs crossed and head tilted to the side. Running away isn't something a cage ought to do. The Mizukige grunted as his hands turned into a blow. Soot release. Black cloud of death. The Mizukige turned his head to the ground and spat out a thick cloud of smoke. In an instant, his surroundings, as well as a huge part of the forest, turned completely black. If he's faster and stronger than me, then I'll take away his vision. His breathing will also be affected by the soot, and it's only a matter of time before he chokes out because of the increased carbon in the air. The Mizukige smiled a bit as he strategized a way to deal with the assassin. This is a rather nifty skill, but it won't do you much. The Mizukige heard a voice from behind him, and immediately rolled to the side. He felt the earth tremble where he had stood before. His sensor skills told him that he had just dodged an axe kick in the nick of time. I guess you weren't all that attentive to rumors about me, but I am a pretty good sensor. Ken slowly got up, dragging his leg on the ground as he stepped forward. ESK. The Mizukige, his hands moved once more. This time he decided on a more damaging approach. Lava release chakra mode. The Mizukige gritted his teeth as he used one of his trump cards instantly. Ken tilted his head as he felt the temperature in the forest rise up. He smiled a bit as he realized what exactly he was feeling. A technique similar to that of the Reikage interesting the Mizukige's entire body was now constantly exuding lava, and was covered in a layer of lava and red chakra. The ground at his feet bubbled madly as it seemed to turn into magma just from coming in contact with his feet. The Mizukige could only grit his teeth as he felt his skin heating up. The technique was a very dangerous one. If used for too long, it would burn someone's insides. It didn't increase speed, but it provided the Mizukige with a layer of defense that harmed his opponents as well as a large boost in attack power. Unfortunately, the form was not sustainable, and Ken could feel it. He could feel how uncomfortable the Mizukige was. Shit, this was supposed to be a last resort. But what else am I supposed to do? One good hit from him and I'm done for. But I only have a few minutes in this form. The only person in the world that could use this form risk-free was the Jinchuriki of the Four Tails. And that's purely because of the Tailed Beast's chakra alignment. Ken immediately tested the waters, throwing a kunai that he spawned in his hand with a flick of the wrist. The kunai melted before it even reached the Mizukige, who just scoffed at the attempt. Don't even think about it. Lava release. Blast breath. The Mizukige brought his hands together once more and spat out a large stream of magma towards the assassin. The Mizukige then punched forwards, and Ken immediately jumped to the side. Looking back, he could see a large ball of magma swallowing his previous position. I don't know if I can easily heal after getting hit by that. Burns are always annoying to deal with. Some also leave scars. I can't attack him physically either. Well, I can try flying slashes, but he can likely block most of what I can do, unless I go all out. Needless to say, Ken was quite impressed. The last thing he had expected was for the Mizukige to actually put up a praiseworthy struggle. So much for just playing around a bit. I guess I was going to spare him as well. He basically has nothing to do with this whole feud, and I didn't think he'd be much of a threat. Ken sent a flying slash, clashing with the magma blast and sending it flying everywhere. He didn't even flinch when a few droplets of magma fell on his skin, burning it slightly as he jumped backwards. Till now, the Reikage and the Tsuchikage were the only ones I thought would be able to give me trouble. The Hokage is also pretty strange. I thought he didn't feel that special in person, but he's supposedly the strongest cage currently. The blind swordsman rolled to the side once more, dodging blast after blast of magma. The forest and ground around him had long since started melting. The rock boiled over into scalding magma, the trees turning into charcoal. The field was now unrecognizable, and the heat created fires that were spreading throughout the forest. Ken sent another flying slash. This time, the Mizukige tapped his hands on the ground, raising a wall of molten lava right in front of him. Ken scowled as he saw his flying slash bend into the magma, which seemed to turn elastic as it bent around his slash and blocked it with efficacy. More and more droplets fell on his body, blocked by his armor which was already heating up and distorting. Ken just scowled and ripped it off his torso, throwing it forward to block a smaller magma bullet while he jumped to the side once more. He wanted to conserve as much energy as possible in case he needed to deal with the Tsuchikage, so he didn't want to go all out either. The blind swordsman jumped as the magma wall turned into a wave that swallowed a good part of the forest below him. The Mizukige seemed to notice that. With a smile, he made a few more hand signs. Lava release. Molten bullets. He immediately spat out dozens of small magma balls towards the assassin that was currently free-falling. They bent around in mid-air, attacking him from different angles and trying to follow his trajectory. As if I'd get hit by that, Ken immediately found his footing in mid-air and vanished right before the molten bullets hit him. The bullets hit each other and caused a bright explosion. The Mizukige panted as he felt his skin burning. I'm wasting too much chakra. Shit, what can I even do if he's able to dodge in mid-air? He had already tried his best to ruin any footing that the assassin might have had. Ken was constantly constantly burning his legs when stepping on the ground. But that didn't seem to do anything, much to the disappointment of the struggling Mizukage. The mist leader looked up to see Ken flickering around in mid-air. He was becoming faster and faster as he gained momentum to the point where he became impossible to track. Shit, what's his next move? The molten cage prepared to raise a dome around him to try and block any attack that the assassin had in stock. And just as he raised that dome, a large flying slash, much bigger and more imposing than the ones sent before, was flying towards him. Despite the raised dome, the Mizukage still rolled to the side, listening to the instincts that screamed at him to dodge regardless of said dome. The defense he had built only served to slow down the flying slash, as it hit the ground with a thunderous screech, creating a large and deep scar in the burnt-down field. The Mizukage didn't even have enough time to exhale properly, as he felt someone else appear further off to the side. Water release. Exploding water colliding wave. The mist leader only had enough time to turn his head and see a gigantic wave heading his way. Shit was all that he had the time to think before the wave collided with him. Steam rose as the Mizukage's temperature cooled down forcefully, almost as if on cue. The lava covering the mist leader cooled down into the stone, trapping him as the water crushed him and pushed him away further into the forest. Ken landed on the now wet ground without any issues. A clone landed near him as well. He had made it in preparation for something similar to what Tosho had pulled off, but he didn't get to use it, unfortunately. There was no need for that. Tosho the blind assassin spoke to the figure that walked out of the still burning forest. I know you would have won, Lord Ken, but I remember you saying that you didn't wish to exert yourself too much before the outcome of the fight is decided. A masked figure walked out of the forest dressed in clothes similar to those of Ken, the only difference being the fact that he wore light armor, more akin to that of Ambu underneath his coat. His mask had one red line in the center, and on his back was a large blade covered in bandages. How are things looking on that front? Ken didn't push the issue further, knowing that Tosho wasn't trying to ruin his fun on purpose. He just dispelled the clone and felt his chakra returning to him. The big fights are still very much the same as when you left, currently an ongoing stalemate. B seems to be slowly gaining the upper hand against the waterfall cage, but he seems to be avoiding large-scale attacks. Because of the presence of allies on the battlefield, Tosho gave his leader a quick situation report. But there wasn't much to give in the first place. Ken had only been missing for around 4 to 5 minutes. Predictable, but it can't be helped. The Reincarnates was adamant about bringing more men along just in case. Seems to have backfired. Ken shook his head while his first blade just shrugged. It's also possible that B doesn't think his opponent would get injured enough to warrant the drain on his chakra. Impossible to read his thoughts. The blind assassin considered Tosho's words for a few seconds, before nodding and slowly turning around. Anyway, I'm sure he'll pull through. He's pretty strong. Can you go and deal with the fodder so the cloud troops can take a step back? Just as a precaution. Tosho nodded and vanished in a puff of smoke. Ken sighed as he was now alone in the burnt-down aftermath of his entertainment session with the Mizukage. The outcome didn't really matter to him in regard to the Hokage's request. There was already no salvaging the alliance, even if they all stopped fighting now. But Ken still wanted the cloud to win. Bloodthirsty warmonger or not, the Reincarnate was still someone Ken could have some use for in the future. He was both already invested in building a friendly relationship with Ken, and already considered Ken an ally. I should check on the Mizukage. He seems to still be moving. The Mizukage's bones trembled. He couldn't even count how many bones in his body were crushed, as the cooled down magma that covered his body cracked and pushed into his body. The pressure of the large wave was too much for the human body to bear. A regular person would have died 100 times over. Thankfully, the Mizukage was still alive. But for how long? He could only move his limbs slightly. Most of his injuries didn't even give him the liberty to use ninjutsu. Technically, I could still survive. The Mizukage's shallow hopes were dashed against the rocks as he felt a figure walk over to him. He half opened his eye to look at the figure of a tall man. The same man that put him in his current position. One wearing a white mask with a large red dot in the center. He didn't look completely untouched. Granted, he was now covered by a slightly burnt coat, wearing only a pair of pants and burnt sandals underneath it. He had on his hip a long blade that dragged on the ground as he walked forward, unperturbed by his appearance. So his clothes had taken damage. The problem was that he wasn't injured in any way. If he lets me live, well, this was a rather anticlimactic ending. You were so focused on attacks coming from the sky that you didn't even bother to look to the side. Ken shook his head as he crouched down near the Mizukage's head. The Mizukage let off a pained chuckle. Indeed, I have much to learn. Too bad I don't have any time left. The mist leader did think of begging to be spared for a second, but he still had his pride. Ken wasn't known for his mercy, and if he was going to die anyway, he was going to die with dignity. You know, you can still leave. I'll just tell the Reincarnate you escaped. He won't question me regardless. The Mizukige's eyes shot open. The man that had already resigned himself to his fate was now seeing a bit of hope. In the first place, he had no business butting in the feud between the Cloud and the other two villages. He had tried to take down Ken only for his transgression against the Mist as the Mizukige. The village was his #1 priority, so he couldn't let its reputation fall off lest its investors gave them fewer missions. But the Mist was going to be left in a really bad spot if he just died there. I am willing to vow to not go after you or the Dark Brotherhood anymore. I also understand that the blades won't be returned, and I'm okay with it as long as you spare me. I can assure you that no one will seek them out while the Mist is under my rule. Ken rubbed his chin for a second. The third Mizukige spoke with honesty, but he couldn't speak for future generations, which was understandable. Fair enough. I had plans to deal with the Mist regardless. But if they're offering to not get involved with us, then I am happy enough. Even if he's lying, in the future I'll kill him before he even thinks of activating that annoying mode of his. He wasn't concerned about the future. By the time the future generations of the Mist sought out the blades, his brotherhood was not going to be troubled by a mere hidden Mist village. At least not if everything went as planned. Okay then, I will remember your words, Lord Mizukige. Ken slowly stood up, much to the relief of the Mizukige, who could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Ken didn't stick around to see how the Mizukige was feeling. He merely threw him a few pills to assist his healing and left towards the battlefield. Let's see how the others are faring. POV narration. The Tsuchikage panted as his body rotated midair, dodging yet another swipe from the lightning-covered Reikage. His small body was filled with scratches and cuts, burns and blood. He was panting, his usually orderly hair now a messy mop on his head. He was missing both of his sandals as well. Meanwhile, the Reikage was in a slightly better form. He was able to avoid the Tsuchikage's attacks, but he was mad at not being able to deal more damage. It couldn't be helped, however, as he was a lot slower in mid-air than on the ground. He knew things would get complicated from the moment that Tsuchikage managed to narrowly dodge his first lightning claw. When the fight began, he had hoped to end the fight sooner. He was already bound to become slower. I can't keep this up for much longer. Using the black lighting chakra mode for a few minutes was a lot more taxing than the regular chakra mode. It was something that the Reikage would use to end battles quickly. It provided a massive boost in explosive force, strength and speed, but it also damaged the user's body over time. Black lighting being a lot more dangerous than regular lighting, and much harder to control. The Tsuchikage seemed to have caught up on that as well. The short man had already stopped attacking, and had gone on a complete defensive streak. He was only dodging attacks and hoping to tire out the Reikage, before likely dealing a finishing blow. I need to end this soon. I wonder how B is faring right now. And as the two Kage were fighting, the Jinchuriki below had transformed the battlefield completely. Ignoring the smoke and fire that had spread out all across the forests around them, the two had already taken on their full-tailed beast forms, and B was seemingly able to restrain Yusuzo. B was currently looking like a purplish mix between an octopus in the lower body, with an upper torso more similar to that of a muscular man. He had grown a pair of gigantic arms. His head looked like that of a bull. Two horns rose out of his skull. Yusuzo now resembled a blue, armored rhinoceros beetle, with 6 green insect wings on his back, along with an actual 7th tail, all growing from the end of his abdomen. He had him on the ground, crushed against the dirt. He was holding him down with all the power he could muster while entangling his wings in his tails. He had managed to not allow the 7-tails Jinchuriki to take flight, which made things much easier for him. The 7-tailed Jinchuriki seemed to be trying to wiggle out of the 8-tails stranglehold. Under normal circumstances, B would have already released a tailed beast blast right into his restrained opponent at point-blank range. But the people around him made things difficult. When surrounded by potential allies, it was harder for a Jinchuriki to go all out. It was already damaging enough that they were wrestling in their tailed beast forms. Unfortunately for B, not everyone in their immediate surroundings was his ally, and not all of them were weak. A few of the rock and mist Anbu on the side decided to step in and help Yusuzo. Earth release. Earth flow spears. Before B could realize what was happening, he immediately felt the ground underneath him and Yusuzo's shift. Dozens of spear-shaped spikes grew out of the ground and pushed into his body. They specifically avoided touching the 7-tails Jinchuriki. He roared in rage as he felt his grip on his opponent loosen for a moment, but it seemed his opponents weren't done. Water release. Water dragon bullet technique. One of them quickly spat out a water dragon, sending it flying out of his mouth and hitting B's gigantic transformed head almost instantly. B's head shot back, his beastly roar shaking the ground around him as he was forced to let go of Yusuzo and protect his body from other jutsu that the Ambi kept firing towards him. It seemed that the other shinobi of the cloud hadn't managed to win over the combined efforts of the other villages. B gritted his teeth as he even felt a few earth chains wrapping around his tails trying to stop him from moving. The 8-tailed Jinchuriki's roar let out a shockwave that pushed back most of the Anbu around him, giving him some breathing space. He turned his head to look at the leader of the waterfall, who had already taken flight with his 6 insect wings. He was floating in the air further away from the camp, seemingly recuperating. Shit, I can't let him get away. I hope everyone else will be fine. B immediately gathered chakra at his mouth, forming a purplish black ball. The shinobi around him immediately got scared of the scene, all of them taking a step back. Yuzuso also started gathering chakra at his own insect-like mouth, forming a large ball of his own. All of the shinobi from before were now scampering, escaping from the battlefield. All of them knew what was coming, and they knew it wasn't going to be pretty. Tailed Beast Bomb. B was the one to finish first. His ball of chakra flew out of his mouth, rushing towards the seven-tailed beast and crushing anything in its path. Yuzuso didn't seem to panic though. Right in the nick of time, he finished charging his own attack. Tailed Beast Ball. His seemed to be a bit smaller than that of B, but it clashed with the 8-tailed Jinchuriki's attack nonetheless. Immediately, the entire world around them seemed to become white, and immediately, a red light washed over the entire battlefield as the two destructive masses of chakra met each other head-on. In the distance, Ken stopped and punched the ground in front of him, raising up a large chunk of the earth in front of him for protection, just as the shockwave spread. The blind assassin could feel gigantic burning trees being uprooted everywhere around him as the blast broke even through his rock shield. He was forced to jump back, as the raised rock cracked completely and turned into shrapnel, piercing through the place where he had been kneeling previously. What destructive power! The tailed beasts really are no joke. To his side, Tosho appeared as well, speaking out with a surprised tone. He was holding the unsheathed Samahada in front of him, blocking any stray rock or tree that came towards him, while skidding backwards from the shockwave. Kane could only release a grunt and nod in agreement. He could feel it in the distance, a heat so extreme that it was easily comparable to the Mizukige's magma. And Tosho could see it clearly in the distance. A gigantic explosion expanded from the contact point of the two-tailed beast bombs. It swallowed up the entire battlefield in a red glow, morphing it into an unrecognizable mess. Shinobi really are mad, Ken muttered as he slowly stood up, ignoring the continuing shockwave while stepping forwards towards the center still. Lord Ken, seems that the fodder of the other villagers has scattered. The cloud shinobi likely lost while I was assisting you. Tosho tried to follow him, still holding the Samahada in front of him for protection. That's fine. You can go hunt them down. Ignore the ones from the mist if they aren't hostile to you. King gave Tosho new orders. He then turned into a blur and vanished towards the battlefield, just as the explosion died down. Now all that Tosho could see in the distance was a large cloud of smoke that covered what was previously a forest. The shockwave had helped the fire spread further, but it also ruined most of the forest by itself, so the field was now barren a few kilometers all around them. The Tsuchikage also took notice of what had happened below. He used the shockwave to dodge one of the Reikage's dashes as well. He was getting tired, and his joints were starting to ache as well. But he couldn't give up and retreat yet. Just a bit longer. I can feel the Reikage getting more and more sluggish, and his senses were working right. The Reikage had at most a few more seconds left. The shockwave from earlier had managed to ruin one of the last chances he might have had to kill the Tsuchikage. One last hit. If I don't kill Onoki, I'll make sure to at least leave him something to remember me by. The Reikage wasn't losing hope. However, he knew he didn't have time left. But a few seconds in that mode could still be the difference between winning or losing. All he needed was a bit of proper footing. B. Immediately, the Reikage's voice roared down at the Jinchuriki. Both Jinchuriki were pushed back by the blast from their tailed beast bombs colliding, but the one pushed back the most was Yusuzo, as he was airborne already. The bull octopus demon was still close enough to hear the Reikage's thunderous shout, so he turned his head and looked up, roaring back as its tail moved at great speeds, flicking up a bunch of rocks like shrapnel towards the Tsuchikage. ESK. Do something, Yusuzo, you stupid snake. The Tsuchikage roared as he moved to avoid the rocks. Then his eyes widened as he realized what was actually happening in front of him. The Reikage was crouched one on a large piece of rock that was flung towards them. In that instant, the world seemed to slow down for the Tsuchikage, his hands immediately moving in front of him as a white orb appeared in front of his palms. But it was already too late to avoid injury. The Reikage used the airborne rock as footing, and immediately dashed towards the Tsuchikage with speeds that the midget could barely even comprehend. Onoki, however, still managed to react on instinct. The dust release jutsu he prepared shot out to meet the Reikage head-on. The Tsuchikage watched in fear as the Reikage sacrificed his arm and completely ignored the jutsu he had thrown out. The Reikage's hand was extended forwards, only one finger pointing towards the Reikage as he formed a sharp lighting spear. In that instant, Yusuzo also acted, having heard Onoki's cries for help. Cocoon. He spat out countless webs of energy in between the Tsuchikage and the Reikage. They bent and weaved to form a large gourd-shaped cocoon around the Tsuchikage. The shield was fast, much to the Reikage's surprise, although his hand was already almost through it by the time it formed completely. Onoki also noticed that the defense Yusuzo could provide was not good enough. At most, it slowed down the Reikage for a split second. Thankfully, that split second allowed the Tsuchikage to do one last thing. A Hail Mary attempt to preserve his life in that situation. reaction, he managed to turn his body slightly and push his legs into the Reikage's spear. In that instant, the Tsuchikage was sent flying. He broke the air around him visibly as he went flying far off. The Reikage huffed in displeasure as he looked back at the rock he had used as footing, which was cracked and almost pulverized. Shit. He pushed off of me. To the Reikage's surprise, Inoki had sacrificed his legs and used them to get away from there. The Reikage didn't even care about losing his arm at that point. He merely allowed himself to fall towards the ground while turning back to his regular lighting chakra mode to conserve energy. He looked at the ground in the distance. A large dust cloud has arose where Inoki had crash landed. The dust seemed to clear quickly though, as one of B's tails waved it away to give them a clear view of the situation. It was exactly as the Reikage had expected. Inoki's small body plunged deep into the rocks of the scorched battlefield below. There was nothing left of his legs below the knee, and his thighs and abdomen were also filled with burns. That compounded with the cuts from before, as well as the not so easy landing that Tsuchikage was unconscious. Yes. Now to finish that food before he could even finish that thought, a yellow light swooped in and scooped the Tsuchikage's broken body. It was Yusuzo, now transformed into a smaller form. His entire body was covered in a yellow curtain, with 6 wings on his back. He didn't even try to engage anymore. Without even looking at the Reikage or B, he flew off in the other direction. Shit. The Reikage landed at that moment, and his legs moved immediately. He dashed through the broken battlefield towards the 2 fleeing cage. His speed easily outclassed them. There was one problem: he couldn't really fly. Thankfully, B was there to help. Yes. His monstrous voice roared as more chakra gathered at his bull-like mouth. Tailed beast ball. Bullets. This time, he swallowed a hastily made tailed beast ball, and immediately started spitting out smaller-sized energy bullets. Dozens upon dozens of them were shot at Yusuzo's tail, forcing the Jinchuriki to do evasive maneuvers while carrying the Tsuchikage. Unfortunately, they were too far away already for B to aim properly, leading to most of the shots missing by a rather large margin. Only one of them seemed to scrape the waterfall Jinchuriki. The zigzagging and scrape managed to slow Yusuzo down greatly, who was also still saddled with carrying Inoki, who was only kept alive by the 7 tails chakra that Yusuzo gave him. Otherwise, the bleeding would have killed him already. The Reikage didn't want that to happen though. He wanted to kill Inoki with his own hand, which was why he took the opportunity to jump towards the still flying Jinchuriki. Yusuzo's expression turned grave as he felt the Reikage's approach. In that instant, he grew his only tail, striking the mad father away while continuing to flee. You fuckers! Yusuzo only heard a string of obscenities coming from the Reikage as he got further and further away. B tried sending a few more bullets towards them as he also ran to get closer, but he was too slow. At that moment, Ken also walked onto the battlefield, appearing on B's right shoulder with his arms crossed. I really missed most of the action. Huh? His tone portrayed some disappointment as he watched the retreating back of Yusuzo. They're getting away. B roared in anger as well, clearly in no mood to joke around with Ken. I'll see what I can do. Ken simply nodded, his muscles wriggling as he visibly transformed, becoming taller, burlier, and covered in scales. In that instant, B felt his shoulder being pushed to the ground underneath him cracking heavily as he realized he was just used as footing, much to Jiki's amusement. The 8 tails roared with laughter, which further annoyed B, who was still frustrated that the targets of his revenge were escaping. He voiced out his complaints inwardly, saying that there was nothing to joke about in their current situation. But Jiki only had this to say: calm down, partner. Those 2 will be lucky if there's anything left of their bodies now that that monster's after them. POV narration. Yusuzo panted a bit as his wings flapped in the wind. He had somehow managed to leave the Reikage behind, taking flight and leaving him on the ground. The lighting charged cage was also tired out by using his more taxing form, which, coupled with his injury, was slowing him down exponentially. Still, Yusuzo was not celebrating a successful retreat at all. The fate of the Mizukage, their ally, was pretty much unknown. Even if he was strong, it was hard for Yusuzo to imagine he would be able to defeat Ken. The waterfall cage took one last look behind him. At that point, the Reikage was a glowing dot in the distance. But he hadn't stopped. He seemed to still be running towards them. He's running out of steam. We should be in the clear for now. That gave Yusuzo the leeway to analyze the situation a bit more. He couldn't help but grit his teeth as the pieces all fell into place in his mind. He had suspected that the red dot was involved in the matter even back when the Shinobi Alliance was crossing the sea. Now, turns out he was involved in finding out the information that set off the Reikage against them. It was too suspicious in the Jinchuriki's mind to be a coincidence. This led to the obvious conclusion, at least to the Jinchuriki, that Ken was either already in cahoots with the Grey Fox, or they were the very same person. From the look of things, he had done things in such a way that he was essentially playing shogi with no one but himself. Everyone, the Reikage, A, B, the Tsuchikage, and even Yusuzo himself, they were all nothing but pieces on his table. And, when looking at the Tsuchikage's broken body, he couldn't help but realize that they had been played really well. It's my fault for keeping that arm, although even if I didn't have it, I think the outcome would have been the same. It seemed that his carefulness had led him to walk directly into a trap. But even so, he didn't think the Reikage would have let them go even if Yasuzo allowed a search and had nothing on him. It was a dark thought, but it seemed that the Reikage's mind was already made up by the time they arrived in that blasted tent. He wouldn't have brought assurance in the form of the red dot there if he wasn't already fixated on killing Yasuzo and Inoki. That was just the type of person the Reikage was. The questions were likely just him trying to find some type of rhyme or reason for his son's death, maybe even a slight hope of recovering his remains. Regardless, Yasuzo was at least sure of who to focus on from now on, and that was the red dot. As soon as he got out of danger completely, it wasn't hard for Yasuzo to realize now that the red dot had done the best job he could to affect his state of mind and thought process during that entire meeting. And, embarrassingly, it had worked like a charm, to the point where Yasuzo was only now putting the pieces together and realizing that the Reikage was essentially just a puppet in the red dot's plan, whatever that was. His intentions are too hard to grasp. I don't even have enough information on the type of person he is, so I can't even begin to guess at them. Many things were public about the red dot. His ruthlessness, his overwhelming strength and skill, assassination techniques that knew no equal, and the mask he wore portrayed that he had something to hide. Maybe he had a family. Maybe he had loved ones. People he cared about, parents, children, whatever it was. After all, there wasn't much reason other than that for wearing a mask, right? I bet that if I could find his actual identity, then I would be able to blackmail him into helping us with the Reikage, but that in itself might be impossible. He also thought of trying to convince the Reikage that he was being manipulated after things died down, but he knew it would be extremely difficult. The hardest thing to do in the world was to convince someone they had been fooled. I need more time to consider things. I don't even know if I can rely on that Tsuchikage anymore. He's certainly not going to trust me. Since I hid the arm from him at that point, Yasuzo gained an idea. Looking down at the injured Tsuchikage, he smiled. Yes, I doubt I'll gain anything by saving him. I reacted out of instinct since we were allies for quite a while, but I don't gain anything from saving him. If anything, he's likely to attack and try to kill me. While blaming this whole mess on my blunder at that moment, Yasuzo looked back. The Reikage was such a small point in the distance that he was no longer even visible. Whatever, maybe I can strike a deal with the next Tsuchikage. I doubt Inoki would have given them the details of our dealings. And at that moment his tail loosened, dropping the Tsuchikage's body at a random point in the forest, the trees and ground below shaking as they broke his fall. A small dust cloud rose where the legless Tsuchikage had landed, signifying that his fall was not pleasant. Trees or not, the Reikage will reach this forest sooner or later. I'm sure he'll find Inoki in his small crater, if he hasn't died already. Regardless, should be a good enough distraction for me to get away. Looking back once more, he noticed something strange. Wait a minute. Why has the Reikage stopped? There was no longer any light in the distance. All he could see was the dark clouds in the sky. Had the Reikage given up the chase? Impossible. Yasuzo and Inoki had killed his son. The Reikage wouldn't have stopped chasing them for anything in that world. At that point, he noticed a large silhouette as the moonlight broke through the clouds. The figure stood amongst the clouds. Somehow it was a humanoid figure, dozens of kilometers away. A human covered in a tattered cloak, a burly body covered in dark green scales which shined in the moonlight, a long tail that seemed to be as big as his body sprouted from his lower back, and on his upper back was a pair of scaled wings, looking similar to those of a bat, spiked and bony, but also covered in scales. Yuzozo's eyes widened as he could see the wingspan of the creature that was observing him from the distance. It was easily bigger than his entire body, flapping slowly as they parted the clouds slightly with each movement. In a split second, Yasuzo turned around and immediately increased his flying speed, knowing that he needed to get away from that creature. One detail gave it away that the creature was not his ally. The only feature he could recognize on that beast, a mask. It was too far for him to discern what type of mask it was. It was too much for his eyes. But his tail beast was telling him to run away almost as soon as he laid eyes on that creature. There was only one person that his tail beast reacted like that around. The red dot, who would have thought that he was an actual monster. His speed increased at the thought of the mad assassin catching up to him. His mind was filled with confusion. How did that make any sense? Since when was the red dot able to grow wings? Did that mean he wasn't the gray fox after all? Don't tell me, does his body morph however he wants it to? That was the only conclusion Yasuzo could reach, as his 6 wings flapped at great speeds to carry him away from the strange monster. After a few minutes, the Jinchuriki made the mistake of looking back once more, and his eyes widened as he noticed that the assassin was now a few kilometers closer, even easier to make out even in the cover of night. Shit. The waterfall cage screamed out loud as he willed his body to go faster. He hoped to somehow outlast the abomination that was hunting him down. Minutes passed, and Yusuzo struggled to keep his heightened pace, constantly looking back, only to see that the assassin was still on his tail, slowly but surely creeping onto his trail. It was clear at that point for Yusuzo that he had made a mistake. Dropping the Tsuchikage didn't seem to do anything to distract the monster hunting him down. I should have waited more before dropping him. Shit. He had inadvertently saved the Tsuchikage with his actions. Well, he had at least given him a chance to live. Inoki was injured plenty, so his survival wasn't fully assured. Yusuzo's chakra had only helped patch up some of his minor wounds after all, and that fall was bound to have done some damage. Still, the situation was not looking good for Yusuzo. The Reikage had likely allowed Ken to continue the chase, and had stopped to tend to his injury. And Ken had possibly missed the moment where he had thrown Inoki just, my luck shit. Fuck this. Yusuzo immediately turned around. He continued flying in the same direction, now facing Ken. I can't outrun him. I don't know if I can outlast him, but I can at least try to stop him. There was too much uncertainty for him to just continue blindly tiring himself out and running in a direction. Without any further ado, he started gathering chakra at his mouth, preparing a small tail beast ball to at least slow down Ken in some way. The ball was about as big as his head. He made it as big as he could and immediately spat it out. The assassin seemed to notice it, but kept flying forwards nonetheless. Yusuzo scowled as he turned back around and kept speeding away, hoping for the best. He turned his head the moment his tailed beast ball reached Ken's vicinity, and he watched as the assassin didn't slow down at all, only extended one of his clawed hands forwards towards the ball of chakra. Shem PH. Arrogant bastard. All the better for me. Yusuzo had expected Ken to dodge the attack. He expected it to do little damage, but he hoped to slow him down at least. It seemed that the monster was going to clash head-on with it, which was a mistake one could only make once. Good riddance. He heard an explosion and smiled. Looking back, he could feel a small shockwave spreading amongst the clouds, parting them as the air around the tailed beast ball burned and exploded. Yusuzo's smile faltered when a figure flew out of the smoke. Still heading his way at the same speed was none other than Ken, his hands still extended forwards, only smoking a bit. At that point, he noticed that the assassin had gained a burst of speed, growing a second pair of wings. What the hell? How am I supposed to get away from this abomination? It seemed that getting away simply wasn't in the cards for poor Yusuzo, but he did put in a valiant effort. Unfortunately, all it took for Ken to close the distance between them was 10 minutes. Yusuzo was panicking so much to the point where he immediately took his tailed beast form when he felt Ken get within 100 meters of him. Don't think you can take me out so easily. Yusuzo let out a beastly roar as his one tail snapped in the air and thrusted forwards, piercing the air at breakneck speeds and heading straight for Ken, who was still flying at him at full speed. The masked assassin spun in the air, flying in a circle around his tail, as he got closer and closer. Stop. Yusuzo's voice was sounding more and more desperate as the assassin's claws were only meters away from his now giant body. Bang! With a thunderous roar, Yusuzo's flight was broken. He was immediately kicked towards the ground with a force that could only be described as overwhelming. He could only let out a pained scream as his massive body crashed into the ground like a meteor, breaking the small mountain it had fallen on. But the Jinchuriki wasn't about to give up. Urged by his tailed beast to get up and at least try something, he immediately started charging up a much bigger tailed beast bomb. I'll take him out alongside this entire mountain range. Unfortunately for Yusuzo, one needed time to charge a proper tailed beast bomb, and as he was doing so, a gigantic flying slash headed directly for him. It was so large that it completely covered the tailed beast's body. It threatened to slash the entire crushed mountain range in two. Yusuzo only roared as he whirled his unfinished tailed beast ball towards the slash, hoping to break it. Unfortunately, it was not the type of attack that could be blocked. The tailed beast within Yusuzo felt it clearly senjutsu. It was at that point that it realized, we're dead. The slash broke through the unfinished clump of chakra, only losing a bit of its size as it immediately came into contact with the tailed beast's body. Sparks flew as its insect-like exoskeleton tried to put up some fight against the slash. It tried to create some sort of cocoon around itself, but it had no time to. In a split second, blood sprouted out as the tailed beast was split in two, right down the middle. The flying slash continued forwards, blasting apart what remained of the mountain range. King continued flying in the sky, panting a bit as he looked at his long blade with appreciation. It's been a while since I went all out. Guess I got even stronger than before. Well, good riddance. No trace of the Tsuchikage. But it is what it is. POV narration. Flying didn't come naturally to Ken. He had practiced it during the creation of Flash Step, but he hadn't actually ever flown with his own two wings. Mainly because he didn't even know he had them. He had only been tracing the Reikage's steps, catching up to him, when he finally sensed his targets flying high in the sky. His frustration rose at that moment when he realized that the waterfall Jinchuriki was much faster than expected. Even if the Reikage was injured and tired, the fact that he hadn't caught up already was impressive in itself. He still had the flash step up his sleeve, but while it would give him the speed to catch up, it was by no means sustainable. It would take a while to even catch up, and it would surely tire him out. At that moment, Ken really wished he could just grow some wings, and from his scaled back sprouted a pair of wings. The assassin was so disoriented at first that he almost tripped and fell, something he hadn't done ever since he was a wee child in his first life. The wings had a strange feeling to them. He could control them like his own limbs, just like his tail. They also ripped the back of his coat apart as they came out, but well, you can't win them all still. It was then that his desire to learn more about himself grew once more. Not that it needed to grow anymore, but it just added more intrigue on top of intrigue. He already knew his body adapted to its surroundings constantly. His underwater form was proof of that. But now, it seemed that his body didn't just shift in major ways because of his surroundings. His transformation depended on his will as well. He may have gotten some hints regarding that when he managed to cover his tenketsu and alter his height, but he didn't think he'd ever be able to grow more limbs from his body. At that moment, the first thing he tried while flying was to grow another arm, but he was not able to do so. He then tried to grow another leg, but that was not successful either. He did manage to alter their size greatly, but did not grow more limbs. He couldn't grow another mouth, nor could he grow himself a pair of eyes. It was regrettable, but also expected, and likely for the better. Getting used to new limbs was not all that easy, and he had already lived his entire life the way he was. What he did manage to do, however, was grow a second pair of wings, which seemed to increase his speed as well. He made his body slimmer as he eventually caught up to the Jinchuriki and struck him down, slashing him in half with his strongest attack. He knew that he couldn't go easy on a tailed beast of all things, so he didn't hesitate to kill it instantly, using the vast majority of his chakra, keeping only enough to not turn to stone. He did notice the distinct lack of Onoki. He had felt the old Tsuchikage somewhere within the forest as he flew by, but the midget seemed to be immobile at the time, so Ken didn't bother going after him and wasting precious minutes. While Yasuzo got farther and farther away, Yasuzo was already at the edges of Ken's perception at the time. Even a minute of stagnation would have likely meant losing him. Sure, following his scent might have been possible, but there was always the possibility of him hiding his scent, making clones and sending them in different directions. Just the possibility was too much of a bother. Well, now that the Jinchuriki was dead, the first thing the master assassin did was to check his corpse. The tailed beast chakra had already dissipated, and the body of the cage returned to that of a human, still split in two right down the middle. His cage hat had long since been blown away, and Ken could clearly feel a split expression of pure terror on his face. It was clear that Yasuzo's last moments were not pleasant, but Ken didn't care for that one bit. He simply walked over to his body and started searching him properly. Eventually, he managed to find the scroll he was looking for, A's arm. Well, it was most likely the scroll that contained A's arm. It was hidden in a seal hidden in between some bandages that he wore on his arm. Better to just take everything to make sure. And so, the assassin did just that. He didn't bother checking the first scroll. Instead, he stripped the Jinchuriki of everything he deemed useful or valuable, before turning around and flying off. Using his wings was certainly more tiring than simply running, but it was also faster. There were no obstacles in the sky, nothing slowing him down. No flock of birds was stupid enough to even attempt to get close to him, so he had free rein to travel in the sky. The stamina consumption of flying meant that he wouldn't be able to do it endlessly like running, but he was certain he'd be able to fly for at least a few days before needing a stop for rest. But his current flight only took around 40 minutes. The chase hadn't taken that long, but the speed they had gone at increased exponentially when Ken grew his second pair of wings, and the Jinchuriki started pushing himself to his limits. Now, Ken just took it at a more leisurely pace, enjoying the wind on his skin as he retracted the scales from most of his body, allowing what little chakra he had left to flow in all but his back. The first thing he felt, the Tsuchikage was no longer where he had fallen. In that instant, Ken dived down into that forest, a confusing scene for the Reikijin, who were observing him in the distance. Ken landed on the ground, raising a cloud of dust around him. In front of him was a rather large crater with the imprint of a small body in the middle. Blood seemed to trail in one direction and into the woods. The assassin's nostrils flared for a second. He immediately picked up a few more scents near the crater. Ambu, likely the trail feels faint. If anything, my chances of catching them are rather low. The main problem was that, no matter how good Ken's senses were, the Ambu still had countless ways of hiding their tracks, and they were used to doing so against countless techniques similar to Ken's. They were no longer within that patch of forest too, outside of Ken's overall senses. I could try to follow the scent of blood, but it seems to cut off at some point, and the others seem to have split up. Ambu are always going to be annoying in the end. The assassin just shook his head and turned around. There was no point in crying over spilt milk. Onoki was strong, but he wasn't someone Ken couldn't handle. Now, the assassin even had an advantage in the air that the Reikage didn't, so that meant that Inoki's strategy of flying up and shooting Kekkei's entire round was not going to be that easy to pull off. Ken's wings provided him with a lot more maneuverability in mid-air, making him a lot harder to hit than someone like the Reikage. Regardless, the blind assassin wrote off at Tsuchikage as someone to keep an eye out for, but otherwise not that worrisome of a threat. He's more likely to target the Cloud than to target the Dark Brotherhood anyway. I doubt he'll put the pieces together and realize I was the Grey Fox as well. Yusuzo had more chances of doing that. He seemed relatively smart, but now he was relatively dead. Still, he had been smart enough to fool the Tsuchikage anyway. Well, he took advantage of the Tsuchikage's panic at the time to pull the wool over his eyes. But it was a win nonetheless. A win that managed to put him in Ken's visors as a person of interest, someone to pay attention to and be careful around. His death meant that Ken could now focus his attention elsewhere. Ken's wings flapped as he reached the Reikage and B in a few more minutes, his wings creating a powerful wind that forced B, who was now supplying the Reikage with chakra, to close his eyes. The Reikage clenched his fist, a purplish aura covered him, and 2 ephemeral tentacles grew out of that aura on his back. "How's the situation? Did you kill the fuckers?" the Reikage asked as the masked assassin landed in front of him and B. "The waterfall Jinchuriki is dead." Here, Ken threw the scrolls he had taken from Yusuzo's body. "Your son's remains should be in one of these scrolls." Ken crossed his arms and turned his head towards the Reikage, who seemed confused. "Why didn't you just check them yourself?" The Reikage's question went unanswered as Ken just shrugged and pretended to look away. He just sighed as he got to work. The Reikage was still recovering. He also wanted to see the remains of his brother. He needed to do that in order to finally accept his death. The very first step of the process of healing from a loss. If there was no body, then even though they knew better, they would still forever be in denial. He started searching through the scrolls with a grave expression etched on his face. Ken just flexed his back, his scales entering his body and disappearing alongside his large wings. The Reikage raised an eyebrow at that. It couldn't be helped, the scene was just that odd. The wings themselves were bigger than Ken's body, and seeing them just disappear was strange. To add to that, the assassin's flesh seemed to shift visibly as he retracted his wings, his muscles twitching as if an earthquake was contained within his body. It was both an unnatural and unnerving sight for B and the Reikage. Meanwhile, the Eight Tails was just intrigued, curious about the nature of Ken's existence still, but it didn't overstep boundaries to try and speak to him again. He merely hoped they would get a chance to do so later. The Reikage didn't dwell too much on Ken's monstrous abilities and body. Instead, his mind focused back on his own body, then on his missing arm, and then he turned back to Ken. "What about the Tsuchikage?" He grasped at his stump. Most of the bleeding had stopped thanks to B's chakra, but it wasn't looking all that pretty. "That midget escaped. He was dropped off in the forest while I was following the Jinchuriki. I decided to prioritize chasing the still-escaping target rather than the unconscious one." Ken's tone was steady, and his words sounded reasonable even, but that didn't mean the Reikage liked hearing them. "What? How long would it have taken to just fly down there and cut his head off?" The Reikage raised his voice without even realizing it. For once, he didn't care about shouting at Ken. He didn't care about diplomacy. He just cared about his son's killer getting away. "I don't know, a minute, maybe a few seconds. But the Jinchuriki was already getting away from my sensor range." Ken didn't react at all to the Reikage's raised voice. If it bothered him, he surely didn't show it. Sensor range, he was in the middle of the sky. If you kept your eyes peeled, you could have tracked him easily. The Reikage scowled, not satisfied at all with the assassin's explanation. "First off, we don't all have eyes, Lord Reikage. Some of us just don't get that lucky. Second, if you had kept your eyes peeled, maybe you could have noticed that the Tsuchikage had only landed a few dozen kilometers from the place you stopped, and maybe you could have finished the job yourself." Ken's tone was just as cold as before, but there was a mocking undertone to it. The assassin didn't bother sticking around to hear the Reikage's response either. "You can send my payment to the Dark Brotherhood compound. Bye." After that, the assassin just disappeared. His job was done there. He saw no point in arguing with the Reikage. He didn't bother to focus on the Reikage, or B, he didn't care what they felt. But the two of them couldn't help but stare at the assassins disappearing back in absolute shock. One of the most intimidating assassins alive, someone capable of hunting down Cage like their prize prey, is completely blind. B's mind had just imploded at that point. The Reikage himself was both too shocked and embarrassed to say anything. Well, that could have gone better. The Reikage sighed as he turned and looked at the scrolls on the ground. He joined B in searching for his son's remains after that, knowing that there was no use in trying to find the assassin. Meanwhile, Ken didn't even spare them a thought. He just smiled as he hoped to feel a nice reaction from the Hokage. "Mission success. I wonder what Tosho is up to. I'll just send him a message to go back to base." Meanwhile, I'll just take my sweet time traveling back to the Leaf POV narration. As promised, Ken took his sweet time returning to the Leaf village. He was sure they would get the message about the alliance falling apart. Hell, he was sure that the world would learn that the seven-tailed Jinchuriki got killed as well. And he was sure that his name would once again sound out in everyone's ears. Getting that much attention was a good thing. However, he had no reason to hide himself, and it just meant more work for the Dark Brotherhood. The Waterfall was not stupid enough to make enemies out of the man that murdered their most powerful shinobi. They were likely just going to bide their time and try to grow stronger over time, but they were never going to pose a threat to the ever-growing Dark Brotherhood single-handedly. Ken was confident enough that the Dark Brotherhood would grow stronger than most villages. Currently, the only villages Ken thought stronger than his Brotherhood were the Cloud and Leaf. Of course, he counted himself amongst the Brotherhood's forces in those calculations. Without him, the Dark Brotherhood would likely still be able to wipe the floor with the vast majority of smaller villages. But the large ones were harder targets. The Brotherhood had already grown a lot in a very short time. The children were all grateful to their leader, and they were also glad to have grabbed onto that opportunity and persisted through the training. Many wanted to quit at first, especially the younger ones. They weren't ever going to train to become shinobi after all. They just wanted to live their lives happily. But thanks to the war taking everything away from them, even their young minds understood that there was no such thing as permanent happiness while weak. That was the realization that sparked their desire to grow stronger. And after a while, the gratitude they felt for the Dark Brotherhood's leader and his retainers was what drove them to become even stronger. Every child strived for their parental figure's agreement and attention. They weren't much different. Tosho had showered them with attention as well. But Ken was a bit different. He was hard to read at first, especially for the younger children. He didn't make too big an effort to get close to them either. At least not at first. Slowly he had also started showing them more and more warmth. He became a stoic pillar to them, a person they looked up to, and the one person that deserved to be called their father. Tosho was more of a big brother to them, raising them, training them, and guiding them as a brother would. He was warm and always there for them essentially. He seemed to develop alongside them as well, growing both stronger and more mature as time passed. Akira was still as childish as all of them though, so he was no father figure. And lastly, Saburo was not exactly approachable. Well, at least he acted friendly enough. They were certainly a dysfunctional family, but Tetsukio and the rest wouldn't have had it otherwise. EOV, Tetsukio. The other children seemed to be getting a bit restless. No one likes whenever our father stays out for too long. But this situation is a bit different from the ones before. We had just dealt with some personal business alongside him. The 7 swordsmen were the targets of his hatred for what must have been years. I remember first walking into his office when he officially started training me and seeing their posters on that wall by his side. It was strange, really, but I didn't pay much mind to it. I focused on my training and grew as strong as possible in that short time. As you already pointed out to him directly, our stoic father figure always taught us, both through his own words and through the others' instructors, that one's feelings should never lead their actions. But then the revenge happened. Sure, it wasn't anything too dangerous for us. The 7 swordsmen were separated and killed off in quick succession. It all seemed fine at first. Father was certainly acting stranger than usual. He wasn't exactly the type to mock his targets after all. After the ordeal was over, much faster than we had anticipated, we all returned to base. And only Father remained behind. It's always hard to tell what goes on in his mind, but I doubt there were any pleasant thoughts in there. Revenge is a messy affair. All of us have been wronged by others in the past, be it to stray shinobi or to bandits. We all lost loved ones that we wish to avenge. But most of us have already chosen to not let that hatred rule our lives. We decided to live on, grow stronger, and live our lives with our new families, while looking forward to the future. It's what our parents would have wanted from us anyway. At least this is the case for most, and for myself as well. I would love to find the shinobi that cut off my leg. I would love to slice his throat with my own 2 hands. But at the same time, it's not even worth the time to seek that lowlife out. I'd much rather spend my time with my brothers and sisters, basking in the warmth of a family, dysfunctional or not. I wish Father thought the same, but at the same time, he was also more than strong enough to take his revenge. He had the means, the resources, the reach, and the influence to handle the backlash from the mist. I guess it just felt wrong to not do it. But the fact that he hasn't returned is what is truly concerning to most of us. After an episode like that, it feels odd not seeing him here. We don't know if he's safe, or how he was affected by finally having his revenge. I know he is safe, wherever he is. In my mind, there isn't much out there capable of matching him in strength. Maybe only the tailed beast and the god of shinobi. It's hard to tell. I've only heard stories about them, but I don't know if there are many humans capable of matching up to our father. Among the older children, there is also that sense of uncertainty. What if father only wanted to build the Brotherhood to take out his enemies? What if he only built it for the purpose of revenge? It was certainly an unusual thought for us, loyal children. Not once has father shown that he just wanted to use us. If anything, he is postponing our use until we are all older and more mature. It's clear that he had plans for the future, or is at least thinking for our future. But that's not the only reason that thought is stupid in my opinion. First and foremost, father is strong. His back won't bend or break in the face of any adversity. He could have easily killed all 7 of the swordsmen without breaking a sweat. And the mist itself is likely nothing to him. Father is not a normal human. That much is clear. Big bro Tetsukyo, when do you think father is coming back? Currently, I am supervising the training of the younger ones. It's my task until Big Bro Tosho returns. Lord Saburo is apparently concentrating on something rather important in his laboratory. The little girl that stood in front of me with a confused expression must be not even 1 centimeter above 1.3 meters. She has short black hair with bangs that cover her eyes. She is currently wearing black training clothes, much like the rest of us. Yumebi, my cutest younger sister. Her body was small and lithe besides you. She is the most flexible one among us. She is also among the youngest, being only 10 years old, 5 years my junior. Don't worry Yume, father is just out on another mission. He'll be returning to us soon enough. No need to worry about him ever abandoning us. My answer sounds a bit generic, but most of my brothers and sister put a lot of weight on my words. So just hearing me say that is enough to comfort them. It seems to have been enough for little Yumebi anyway. She just nodded with a cute smile on her face and skipped off to continue her training. Feeling them respect and look up to me this much is a bit stressful. Is this how father feels when looking at all of us? I somehow doubt it. He is a greater man than me. I still have much to learn. After father personally trained me, I became one of his 2 direct disciples. You and I, both of us, have gained a heightened position in the eyes of our brothers and sisters. Even if you isn't fully a part of the Brotherhood, she still is an honorary sister to us, and Master's first personal disciple. I am the second, despite being the first among my peers. TSK. So you think leader is still planning to use us in some way? Was using us for his revenge not enough? Here comes number 2, can't ever get any time to rest with this guy around. What's your point exactly, Morita? Morita, a blonde 14-year-old standing at around 1.7 meters, the same height as me. He is 1 year younger. MR.2 as he is called. He is the second ranking among us recruits. The one that sits right under me. My point is that we should ask this so-called father to clarify his intentions. His voice grates my ears, but I don't blame or resent him either. There is no such place for these emotions in a true family. He is a disillusioned child. Father's attention and time aren't limitless, and the children that don't get his recognition may end up throwing tantrums. This is just one example of that. A childish outburst, teenage angst, whichever it is. I don't resent my little brother for it. I have matured faster than my peers, maybe fueled by trauma among other things, but I have a good understanding of a child's mind. Still, he's lucky that Yu is currently back at her real father's home, visiting him after a big mission. If she was here, then no rumors about Lord Ken would ever be flying around as they are, and no one would dare to speak out like this. I'm pretty sure she would have spiked his food with a strong laxative at best. Regardless, he wouldn't have ended up too well. But I also shouldn't let him speak in such a manner about father. It's straining the atmosphere and interfering with the training of my smaller siblings. Just as I was about to tell Morita off, someone decided to interject. Maybe if you have such complaints, you should address them to him directly. A deep voice broke out at the side, and another person appeared in the field. It was none other than Big Bro Tosho, with that strange living sword wrapped in bandages and strapped on his back. Big Bro, even if Morita has complaints about father, he would never dare to speak out against Tosho, who recruited all of us, and has essentially raised us this whole time. As expected, the children flocked to him, all excited to hear news about both Tosho and our father. Morita sulked a bit to the side, unsure how to react. Tosho took off his mask, smiling at the children and speaking to them a bit, before he finally walked up to Morita, who was standing at the side awkwardly. The children were silent as they saw that. They didn't know what to expect. They may have had their own dissatisfaction, but Morita was the only one to voice them out in that manner. It had been the first time one of them had actually done such a thing, so they didn't know how Tosho or their father would react. I was serious. Toshio's voice was calm, his gaze was warm as he looked at the blonde fledgling assassin. What? Morita seems a bit panicky and confused. Thankfully, Big Bro Tosho didn't let him stir in confusion for too long. If you have any issues, don't hesitate to speak up. Leader may seem a bit cold outwardly, but he takes all of your opinions into account. If you have any complaints, you can always speak to him. Huh. I can see the panic vanishing from Morita's face. He just skulked, rubbing his elbow and looking at the ground with a childish pout on his face. Tosho then turned around to the other children. All of you can speak to him. The doors to his office are open most days. Currently, he's out dealing with the leaf and making some deals. But he will be back soon. Tosho then patted NR.2 on the shoulder, nodding to him, before leaving us to our training. As soon as he left, the children broke into talk, voices overlapping each other as they spoke of things they wanted to tell their father, and how excited they were for him to come back. Knowing them all, they'll keep this up till dinner. We can't have that. Get back to training if you're done gawking. My shout seems to have awakened them back to reality. Father isn't home yet, so they needed to continue their training and wait for him diligently. Morita, as much as he likes to complain, also went back to training. We really are a dysfunctional family. POV narration. The war turned the entire world and elemental nations into a turbulent ocean. Many waves rose and fell, breaking against each other as well as the rocks that popped up from time to time. But the news that broke out was what completely shifted the tide of the current war. The complete breakdown of the largest and most powerful alliance that had originally started the war. Its circumstances were strange. A few rumors circulated said that the Reikage's son was murdered by the Tsuchikage, who colluded with the Waterfall Cage and Mizukage. Other rumors said that the Reikage attacked the others in a fit of rage, without any proper evidence and only speculations. To that point, only the Waterfall Cage was confirmed dead. His bisected body had been found by a few wandering shinobi that were fleeing from the scene. Reports spoke of the man's fitful gaze even in death. They were also quickly able to speculate who the perpetrator was. The Dark Brotherhood's involvement in the matter was a public thing already. Although Tosho had done his best in hunting them down, there were too many Ambu to track down and kill in order to keep rumors in check. But all was fine. To Ken, the rumors would just provide validity to the success of his mission. Although now the world believed him to be in some sort of alliance with the Reikage, there were several rumors regarding that as well. His involvement here, coupled with his involvement in the death of the Mist Swordsman, led many to speculate that the Dark Brotherhood was now getting involved in the Shinobi Wars. Some speculated that he only got involved in order to avenge the son of the Reikage, as they were rumored to have known each other. There was also the speculation that the Dark Brotherhood was just the Reikage's hired help, which was what had actually happened. The Mizukage was able to confirm that eventually, clearing a few things up with his recollection of events after he finally returned to his homeland and spoke to the rulers of the Land of Water. He wasn't able to confirm much else regarding what had occurred, only confirmed that the Reikage had accused the Tsuchikage and Waterfall Cage of killing his son. He wasn't able to confirm who had killed the Seven-Tails Jinchuriki of the Waterfall, but he did say it was most likely the Red Dot, claiming that the Reikage was injured against the Tsuchikage. Thanks to his words, and the royalty of the Land of Water that decided to spread it, the events of that day became a lot clearer. No one really knew what means the Red Dot had used to kill the Waterfall Cage. People that had seen the scene of the split mountain did say that it was most likely an overwhelming force. The fact that Ken was capable of such a thing essentially cemented him as a figure on par with the god of Shinobi in the eyes of the elemental nations. There was also more interesting news circulating regarding the Red Dot, things that were more personal in nature, rumors on the streets, among restaurants and inns all over the elemental nations. The Red Dot, the world's strongest bounty hunter, is blind. It was a difficult pill to swallow, especially for people that had dealt with Ken before, like the Grass Village and even the Mizukage. The rumor itself was believed to have been spread by a grieving bee in a tavern in a random village within the Land of Lightning. It was spread in the form of a rap, which was typical for the Jinchuriki. Rumors also said that bee was currently still under house arrest as a punishment for spreading said information in his drunken stupor. 2 weeks was all that was needed for that much to get out in the world, and Ken was still leisurely walking towards the Land of Fire at that time, both unaware and unbothered by any news getting out. It wasn't like he cared about hiding his lack of sight. He had already foreseen that his reputation would grow in the entire debacle. It was only natural. He realized that would be the case from the moment he accepted the Reikage's request to get personally involved in the whole mess. More reputation, more influence, more money. More enemies. Regardless, things are looking up for the Dark Brotherhood. By the time the assassin was at Konoha's gates, he was already accompanied silently by a few masked Ambu. They formed a circle around him as he walked forwards. No one stopped him or questioned his presence. Instead, they led him as he walked towards the cage building. Before actually stepping into the village, the blind monster formed the hand signs for a very basic transformation. He altered his height as he allowed his back to slouch over. He immediately took the form of a wrinkly old man with a straw hat and permanently closed eyes. He wore the clothes of a civilian and wore the large backpack of a peddler, a very basic disguise as an old traveling merchant. The Ambu around him looked at the transformation for a second, before nodding to each other and tightening the circle around Ken to avoid any slight possibility that he would slip through and they'd lose sight of him. After all, The red dot had proven that he was a lot more dangerous than the Seven Tails, a tailed beast capable of leveling a small village in seconds. Sure, Konoha had its defenses, but it was better to not take any chances when dealing with such a potential threat. Anyway, having a posse of mask-cloaked men was certainly catching the attention of others within the village. Quite a lot of gazers were on Ken as he walked on the pebble streets of the Leaf. From gate guards and common shinobi to stall owners, children and civilians. Ken didn't pay them any mind, although he didn't exactly like the attention. He liked making sneaky entrances whenever possible. Taking people by surprise was always entertaining, and it also provided him with an edge in any negotiation that would take place. Alas, it wasn't like he could sneak into the Leaf Village effectively. Their detection was a lot better than that of the Land of Iron, thanks to the seals they employed. Ken was still quite far from a Fuinjutsu master, so bypassing their seals was easier said than done. Space-time ninjutsu was a way to do it though, but he needed to leave a reverse summoning mark somewhere in the village for that. Better to try and do that later. Here's hoping I won't need it, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Having an easy way to reach a hidden village could come in handy, but he needed to hide the reverse summoning scroll very well. It was also possible that the hidden leaf had some countermeasures against a reverse summoning jutsu, but Ken wouldn't know it unless he tried. His method of using the summoning jutsu was quite unheard of from what Kazu had claimed. Marking others as contracted beasts was an extremely unusual way of going about things apparently. Figures. Shinobi was supposed to think around the rules around them, but most limited themselves to the rules of their techniques, which was why most shinobi still needed to perform all hand signs for even basic jutsu. In truth, rules existed to be bent and changed to one's will. It was just the nature of things. At least Ken believed it to be so. Ken and his posse of Anbu didn't take a long time to reach the cage building. In there, the disguised assassin was led directly to a meeting room. Tables and chairs all circled around an empty circle in the middle of the room. Ken could sense several figures within the room, plenty of them relatively powerful. If my senses don't fail me, these are likely the heads of the most prominent clans. I guess the war is really going well for them to have the time to gather like this. Ken mused to himself as he stepped into the middle of the room without any hesitation, much to the surprise of most of the clan heads present. Oh, he seems quite bold. I like him already. A large, fat man spoke out from the side. His hairstyle was similar to Ken's as well, having long spiky hair flowing all the way to his lower back. The only difference was that his was more puffed out, similar in style to an afro on top. Calm down, Shamsa. This isn't the time to make friends. A colder, more calculating voice spoke out from the side. A slimmer man with his hair caught upward in a ponytail was the one speaking out this time. He does have a point, Shikaku. This may very well be a good chance to form a friendly relationship with one of the strongest men alive. Another solemn voice added from the side. The speaker this time was also a slim man with sunken cheeks. His hair was caught in his headband, and he wore his hair spiky on top and ending in a long ponytail that reached all the way to his lower back. Enough, Inoichi. Shikaku Choza, a colder voice from the side, commanded the clan heads to be silent in a demanding and arrogant tone. Ken tilted his head as he realized the identities of some of the people in the room. If I'm not mistaken, the ones that spoke out first were the clan heads of the Akimichi, Nara and Yamanaka respectively. Their trio is considered to be quite deadly. I can appreciate their honesty at least. The one interrupting them may be the young head of the Uchiha clan, Wicked Eye Fugaku Uchiha. I heard a lot about him and his clan. They possess what is considered the strongest Dojutsu. Ken rubbed his chin as he undid his transformation, surprising absolutely none of the clan heads. It's been a while, Lord Hokage, and it is a pleasure to meet with the various clan heads present here today. Ken took a slight bow, showing his respect to the people present as a gesture of goodwill on his part. That gesture was returned for the most part. Most of the people present either bowed back slightly in their chairs or nodded in appreciation to the assassin. Ken did feel two people scoffing at his greeting, which gave him enough knowledge on who to focus on during the meeting. The head of the Uchiha, and I don't actually know the other one. Ken felt a man that stood right by Hiruzen's side scoffing. He seemed about the same age as the Hokage. He had a shaggy hairstyle, tufts of hair reaching eye level. He seemed to be dressed in standard jointed armor, with slight variations, much like the rest of the clan heads present. Ken could also feel a distinct scar on his chin when focusing hard enough on his face, which gave away his identity. Danzo Shimura, the third Hokage's right-hand man. Ken's lips pursed as he turned his head to the Hokage. I think you have already heard about what happened with the alliance. Ken raised his head and angled his mask towards the Hokage. Hiruzen took a puff from the tobacco pipe in his hand as he nodded. It was hard to believe, really. I was not expecting such a performance, in all honesty. Saratobi smiled as he looked at the assassin with an appreciative gaze. Oh, it was nothing, I just happened to have the right motivation. Ken nodded back to the Hokage, who just sighed at his words. Oh Lord, if others could accomplish that much with just motivation, this war would have ended within a few days. Hiruzen puffed out a cloud of smoke as he smiled and prepared to compliment the assassin's work. but Danzo chimed in at just the right moment. Enough senseless posturing, you did your part of the deal. It's only natural for you to do so. Now, although not all elders of this village agreed to make the deal with you, the Hokage gave his word before consulting with us, so we are obliged to keep it. His rough voice did help turn the atmosphere in the room a few degrees colder. The other elders and clan heads present didn't react in any meaningful way, likely already used to Danzo and his temperament. Hiruzen frowned a bit, but he didn't dispute Danzo's words. He had taken quite the drastic decision all by himself, but he had figured it to be the best course of action for the benefit of the village. After all, he didn't lose anything even if Ken failed. And even if he succeeded, the Hokage knew that the assassin's request was a rather easy one to achieve. Glad to hear the deal is still going through. I would hate it for there to be complications at this stage. Ken nodded at Danzo as he smiled underneath his mask. His tone was cheerful, happy even. The Hokage's right-hand man narrowed his eyes at the assassin's veiled threat. It was so vague that it couldn't even be considered a threat, so Danzo couldn't even call him out on it. So, how come the Toad Sage is not present in this meeting? Ken tilted his head as he crossed his arms. Before that, I hope you wouldn't mind taking off your mask. It is quite rude that you're facing us, while keeping your identity hidden. Fugaku scowled at the assassin, finally speaking out, much to the displeasure of the Hokage. Great, we're back to senseless formalities. Danzo also rolled his eyes at the clan leader's arrogance. But Fugaku had all the reason to be arrogant. He was the clan head of what was most likely the strongest clan currently alive. To everyone's surprise, Ken didn't even hesitate for 1 second in taking off his mask. I must admit, there is not much of a face there. I hope that won't be a problem, Uchiha. Ken's voice did sound a few degrees colder, sending a shiver down the spines of some of the people present, especially when combined with what they saw. Fugaku's scowl receded as his eyes widened. Every elder and clan head stared at the mangled face of the world's greatest bounty hunter. Their reactions were different. Some looked with shock and awe, some with pity, and some with disgust. The older elders seemed to be less sympathetic, but the clan heads were mostly shocked. Fugaku also seemed to scratch his head, flabbergasted in a sense, his gaze wandering off to the side, away from the assassins. So the rumors were true. Hiruzen even blurted out in shock. He hadn't quite believed them at first, but now, he had no choice but to believe them. Same for Danzo, who immediately started thinking of ways to use the red dot's condition against him. Rumors? Well, whatever. I hope this won't be a problem. Lord Hokage. Ken nodded once more towards the Hokage, his eyeless face turned towards him the same way as before. It seemed a lot more creepy now that everyone realized Ken was just turning his head for show, not to look at others. It won't be an issue. Apologies for the outburst. The Hokage slightly bowed his head, showing the assassin respect, much to the disapproval of Danzo. I also would like to apologize for forcing you to reveal your face. I'm sure you were wearing a mask for a reason. Having your identity exposed in such a way is unfortunate. Hiruzen showcased a shocking amount of honesty. Ken was genuinely surprised. The clan heads didn't seem all that shocked, some of them even nodded in understanding. After all, the only reason one would wear a mask was to protect their identity, right? It was clearly a fixture of Ken's. He likely kept his private life separate, since he was an elusive individual. It is fine. No one besides the Dark Brotherhood knows this face. My identity is my mask. The fixture of a red dot, it's become a lot more symbolic than a malformed visage. The clan heads all seemed to sweat a bit at his words. In a sense, it was to be expected from the world's best bounty hunter and assassin. His identity had become so ingrained in his psyche that he didn't even think or care about having a private life. To Danzo and Fugaku, such a thing was certainly commendable. It made the assassin seem quite a bit more impressive in their eyes. Well then, currently, we are holding a war meeting. Your arrival was a bit of an interlude. Honestly, I will send word for Jiraiya to come back urgently, but you will have to stay within the village for a few days. I hope that is not an issue. The Hokage quickly pulled the subject back on track, and the assassin just nodded. That is okay with me. After that, the assassin nodded, putting his mask back on and turning around. The Ambu that had led him to the cage building were the ones to lead him to his temporary house, a small apartment off to the side of the cage building. Highly monitored. At least they have nice snacks, Ken thought to himself as he bit into a few dangos on a stick. He had asked the Ambu for them, and they surprisingly gave him whatever he wanted. Hurry up and wait. Huh. In the end, the assassin just sighed and went on with his day. Unbeknownst to him, a plot was already unraveling in the darkness, as a few shinobi of the Sand Village had somehow managed to slip past the village's defenses. Their objective, the Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails POV narration. The blind assassin yawned as he did a few more handstand push-ups to pass the time. A long sword leaned on the wall by the side of his relatively large room. He was given privacy within the confines of that home, but every exit and entrance to the house was closely monitored. They really aren't taking any chances. He didn't feel all that bad about their lack of trust. A hidden village would normally be that guarded. It was mostly the same while he was at the Cloud Village for a while. It did irritate him that the village elders weren't quite appreciative of his efforts. Danzo even had the gall to imply that Konoha didn't have any obligation to hold its part of the deal. The assassin was half a mind to kill him then and there. There was no point in trying to build friendly relations with a nation that didn't show him any respect or goodwill. But it seemed that the Hokage had already talked with Danzo beforehand, and Hiruzen was adamant about keeping his part of the deal. At least that was the vibe that Ken had gotten from that meeting. Only the Hokage and some of the clan heads were friendly and seemed to wish to form some sort of alliance. Maybe they were a bit forward, but at least they were respectful. It would have been nice if the others were a bit more tactful, unlike the Uchiha clan head, who essentially ordered Ken to take off his mask. Now, the blind monster didn't care about people seeing his face. He had no reason to care about it, but it was simply a lack of respect at the end of the day. One wouldn't ask a foreign Anbu to take off their mask if they were making a deal with a different land. It didn't matter if they were in the presence of the whole war council or not. Ken was not some random bounty hunter off the street. He was a legend of the shinobi world at that point, leading an organization that was the equivalent of a hidden village in the land of samurai. He didn't need his ego to be inflated by some useless village executives, but some respect could have still gone a long way. Whatever, shinobi will always be shinobi. My presence does warrant a certain degree of caution. The real problem was the Hokage's right-hand man, and his shady demeanor. That Danzo, he isn't even an elder from what I remember. Just Hiruzen's attendant. There isn't much information about him out there. All I know is that he used to be in the same team as the third Hokage. Ken pondered about it for a few minutes, but he couldn't do anything besides sigh in the end. Then he felt something strange. His senses fled. He felt as if a blanket had been taken off of his head. The barrier's fallen. The Fuinjutsu that made infiltrating Konoha undetected fell for exactly 1 minute. It was almost unnoticeable to a regular shinobi. It came and went fast. But the outage was noticed by Ken's enhanced senses. The more powerful people within the city were bound to have noticed it as well. It was clear what had happened. Someone infiltrated the village. Ken had no way of knowing why exactly. He wasn't paying full attention to the entire village, too much information to process. His mind was still human after all. But the Leaf was sure to start investigating instantly, and they certainly jumped into action quickly. Ken could feel a few of the people stationed at his house running off, leaving it with less supervision. I'll take this chance. Might as well find a place to hide that scroll, and investigate whatever is happening in the hidden village. I can use that as an excuse as well, if I get found out. Ken's curiosity ended up taking the better of him, and he immediately turned into a blur. The first thing he did was use the distraction of his watches to create a lighting clone, to which he bestowed most of his chakra. He left it in the bedroom before turning into a blur. He escaped from his extremely small window, his body twisting and bending unnaturally at great speeds, as he ran off into the distance. The shinobi observing his house weren't able to observe his departure due to the mess that came with reorganizing their surveillance to work with fewer people. Ken couldn't really feel them blink because most of them wore masks, but he trusted his speed to slip by unnoticed. The blind assassin took off his mask and tied his hair in a spiky ponytail, leaving a long tuft of hair to obscure most of his face beside his mouth. He also took off his armor and put on the most unassuming clothes he had. He looked just like a civilian. He blended into the village with ease, walking on the streets with a wide smile on his face. He also managed to find a nice place to leave a reverse summoning scroll, right underneath a large dumpster without wheels. It's gonna be unpleasant to get reverse summoned into trash, but hopefully, they won't find it. The disguised assassin then put his hands behind his head and whistled as he walked off. The defensive barrier in the city was unlikely to spot him as a difference, since he hadn't even left himself enough chakra to be classified as a genin, so he was free to wander for now. Ken wasn't stupid, however. He realized that some more skilled shinobi will be sent to his home to check on him. If they were skilled enough, they would also notice that he had left a clone there, but only someone like the White Fang or the Hokage personally might be able to tell the difference, so he wasn't particularly worried about getting found out. Even if he was to be found out, it wasn't like he was doing anything bad. And so, his elbows raised to the sky as he smiled and blended into the streets. He looked so unassuming that no one even bothered to give him a second look. His presence was fleeting, but his senses were spread out all around him. He was feeling the wind bend around various houses within the village, and he was looking for anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, he found it. A rather large home in the distance, currently vacant. One door was open large, and there were no real signs of struggle. But Ken noticed quite a few lingering scents as he got closer to the house. It mostly permeated with a sweet smell, likely belonging to a young girl. But there were 4 more distinct smells fresh in that home. And as he stood at the door of that house, he also felt other shinobi approaching the house from other directions. I guess someone important lives here. It may be worth following the scents for now. It'll take a while for them to track it otherwise. It felt odd. The home belonged to a little girl alone from what Ken could sense, and the other 4 seemed to be grown men. It's worth observing them for a bit. Ken smiled, his hair swaying in the wind, as he turned into a blur right before shinobi surrounded the house. He immediately started tracking down the culprits. He jumped over the village walls without even bothering to look behind. Strangely enough, there weren't many people guarding that part of the wall, which was likely why the intruders had targeted it to begin with. As he ventured further into the forest at a steady pace, he picked up on yet another scent. Another person started tracking them down. Strange. Was he waiting outside for his allies? But he seems to be trailing the intruders much like I am. The assassin was like a bloodhound, his spiky ponytail swaying in the wind as he jumped from tree to tree. The bangs of hair covering his scarred face didn't move at all, disregarding the wind. He trailed the scents perfectly. He was able to reimagine the route they had taken, the way they had walked, their positions. The girl seemed to be either tied up on one of the kidnappers' shoulders or on his back, and the other 3 kidnappers all seemed to form a triangle around the one carrying the girl. 2 stood in line with him, 1 covered their backs. Meanwhile, the other scent he had tracked seemed to trail behind them perfectly. The person in question seemed quite trained, but the blind assassin could still notice some mistakes, like the fact that he had left some fallen leaves behind. Thankfully, the kidnappers hadn't noticed it, but it was still a rather big mistake for a good assassin. Then again, shinobi aren't exactly conventional assassins. Most of them are soldiers that use special tricks to fight. Only the Anbu, the special ops, really handle assassinations. Normally the Anbu was certainly the most trained when it came to stealth, but there were some exceptions of jonin that were particularly good at it. Ken had come to realize that nature energy and the special skill he had created in his past life were the only reasons he could outmatch some of the more skilled shinobi in stealth. They were just that good. If they had the tools he had, they would have been just as skilled. But they lacked the talent to create such a sadistic technique, and for some reason, not many people could handle nature energy like Ken could. Still, the shinobi he was trailing were all skilled. The 4 kidnappers were covering their tracks perfectly, and the one tracking them was skilled enough to not get noticed by them. Eventually, Ken ran into something interesting: the unconscious body of one of the kidnappers. It made him pick up his pace, no longer taking the matter so leisurely. He started spreading his senses to their limits, his mouth turning into a slight smile. The person tracking the kidnappers is a lot more skilled than I gave them the credit for. It seems he was able to take one out without any of them noticing it. It wasn't long before he finally found the group, his senses finally catching up to them, as he turned into a blur and appeared on a tree right above them, concealing his presence effortlessly. Sensing the situation down in the forests, he realized that things were certainly dire. One of the kidnappers appeared to have been stabbed in the chest with a kunai. The other 2 seemed to be encroaching on the girl and the young boy. A boy wearing an opened-up sweater, regular pants and sandals, and a headband on his forehead. His hair was also raised up high and spiky. So the skilled tracker that made a mockery of these trained shinobi that infiltrated the village is a boy as young as I am. Well, it's hard to tell. He may be even younger. The boy seemed to have pulled the girl away from the kidnappers. He was also uninjured, which was an accomplishment in itself. He wasn't even panting, but he had lost the element of surprise. The shinobi were in a formation that made it impossible to take them all out silently one by one. He had only managed to pick off the one that had stayed in the back, but the other 3 were too close together, and they were all in each other's peripheral vision. That much Ken was able to tell when he was tracking their scents as well, which was why he hurried to catch up to them. Each kidnapper seemed to be carrying a weapon. One had a sword, and the other had a ball and chain, which was wrapped around his wrist. Ken couldn't tell much about their appearance, besides the fact that they wore generic shinobi clothing and masks. They had no headbands, so he couldn't tell what villages they were from. Minato. The little girl's tired voice was the first one that Ken heard. She seemed shocked to see him. Ken could feel some of her features as well. She seemed to be wearing some sort of dress, alongside sandals that extended upwards to her thighs. She seemed to have very long hair, and she also wore her headband in the same way as Minato. And then he felt the chakra within her so much that he couldn't even sense an end to it. It was only then that he finally realized who she was. The current 9-tailed Jinchuriki Kazu's little sister, Kishina Uzumaki. Ken could feel the young man's head angle towards Kishina and give her a warm smile. The calm smile on Ken's mouth receded a bit when he felt that. His lips turned downward in a slight scowl, but he wasn't scowling at the Minato rescuing Kishina. He wasn't scowling at his bravery, but rather at himself. A child so kind ended up as a shinobi. This world really is unfair, but then again, could Ken really claim that the boy was an exception to the norm? The assassin couldn't help but think back to the shinobi he had killed in the past. How many of them had the potential to give someone such a warm smile? How many of them had the potential to live a fulfilling life? The truth was that Ken had no way of answering that question. He couldn't possibly know. He had never bothered to look at shinobi in such a way. To him, they were barely even human, not deserving of a second look as their corpses dried out in a field. He had forged alliances with some, but he had kept them at arm's length. He hadn't ever cared about actually befriending shinobi, but it was the smile of that child that reminded him that shinobi were people as well, not the screams of pain and agony of the thousands he had killed in cold blood. For a second, that realization dwelled on the assassin's shoulders, before he heaved a sigh and shook his head. Innocent or guilty? Why did I think it would be a good idea to take it upon myself to judge that he remembered his promise for a second? To plunge a blade into his own stomach if he took the life of an innocent? He had no way to prove that he had done so yet. But now he also realized that he was too conceited. Who am I to judge them anyway? He was nothing more than a maniac fulfilling whatever fantasy of justice he had in his mind. Nothing more than a hypocrite. Well, better that I realize this now than never. The two unmarked shinobi seemed to have approached Minato and Kushina. The young man was preparing to roll backwards with Kushina still in his hands. He hadn't even managed to untie her yet, but he had cut away some of the rope already. The two shinobi seemed to be fast though, at least faster than him, while he was carrying Kushina. But they didn't get to reach Minato and Kushina. They both stopped dead in their tracks, their muscles standing rigid at the sight in front of them. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared behind their targets, a figure they could only describe as frightful. He was tall, filled with muscle, his face was mostly covered by hair, and he wore regular civilian clothing. But there was just something unnerving about the way he appeared in front of them. Neither shinobi could even feel his presence there. They both gulped as they thanked God for having their sights intact to even be able to see their opponent. But they soon realized that seeing their opponent didn't matter at all. A chilling murderous intent exuded out of the man in the very next second. Their hair stood straight as their spines trembled in fear. No amount of training could have ever prepared them for that feeling of dread that set in alongside that man's presence. They weren't prepared at all. Nature itself didn't seem to be prepared for his rage. The grass around them all started bending away from the people they were trying to approach. The trees around them seemed to be bending away from them as well. Both Minato and Kushina noticed that change, their eyes widening in shock. They couldn't feel the murderous intent, it wasn't directed at them at all. But they still got a feeling of dread just from seeing the way nature reacted. They slowly looked behind only to see a tall man tower over them. His face was mostly covered by hair, but they could only see his mouth, noticing a cold scowl on it. Seems I've run into something interesting. The man's cold voice sent shivers down the spines of all of the people present. I hope we can get out of this alive was the only thing Minato could think of at the time. And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part. So be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, we'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out these videos right here for more awesome isekai anime content.